Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The steering wheel was still warm with my frustration when I merged onto Highway 1, 3 hours after my flight to San Diego had departed without me. My boss had called an emergency meeting that turned out to be 45 minutes of him pontificating about quarterly projections while my boarding window slipped away like sand through fingers. When I'd finally escaped his office, racing through LAX had been pointless. The gate agent's sympathetic shrug told me everything. Drive it, I'd thought. Make something worthwhile out of this disaster. The Pacific stretched out to my right, deceptively calm under the late afternoon sun. I'd taken this route before, but never with this particular weight in my chest, that peculiar mix of anger and liberation that comes from plans unraveling. The rental car hummed steadily, and I let myself sink into the rhythm of the curves, each turn revealing another postcard view I was too irritated to properly appreciate. The first alert buzzed through around Malibu. I glanced at my phone mounted on the dashboard. Coastal evacuation warning, potential landslide activity. I dismissed it. California was always warning about something. Earthquakes, fires, mudslides. Part of the ambient anxiety of living here. The road ahead looked clear, and I needed this drive. 20 minutes later, the second alert came with an insistence that made my teeth ache. That sharp electronic wail that cuts through everything. This time I couldn't read it properly while driving, but I caught fragments. Immediate coastal areas. Seek higher ground. The radio, which had been playing classic rock, dissolved into static before cutting to an emergency broadcast. The announcer's voice carried that practiced calm that somehow makes everything worse. Authorities were advising evacuation of low-lying coastal areas due to unusual tidal conditions. No specifics, just that weightless phrase hanging in the air like fog. That's when I noticed the road. At first I thought it was just wet from spray, but the pattern was wrong. The moisture extended too far inland, reaching places where no wave should touch even during storms. Worse were the drag marks, long, dark streaks as if something massive had been pulled across the asphalt. Kelp lay scattered in thick ropes, still glistening, still writhing slightly in the wind. But we hadn't had storms. We hadn't had anything. The smell hit next. Brine so thick I could taste it, mixed with something else. Something organic and wrong, like a tide pool left to rot in the sun. I cranked the windows up, but the smell had already permeated the car's interior, coating my throat. A rest area sign appeared through the growing dusk. Vista Point, 2 miles. I needed to stop, needed to check my phone properly, maybe call someone. The alerts were coming faster now, my phone vibrating against the dashboard in an irregular heartbeat. The parking area materialized out of the coastal mist that had begun rolling in with unnatural speed. 3 cars sat abandoned in the lot, parked at odd angles as if their drivers had stopped in haste. I pulled in slowly, my headlights sweeping across the vehicles. A Honda Civic with its driver door hanging open, a pickup truck with emergency flashers still blinking weakly, a minivan with luggage strapped to the roof, vacation interrupted. I touched the Honda's hood as I passed, still warm, engine ticking as it cooled. Maybe 30 minutes, 45 at most. Fresh enough that whoever left should still be nearby. The path to the observation area was marked by more of those drag marks, and the kelp here was thicker, forming almost deliberate patterns. No, that was paranoid thinking. Kelp couldn't be deliberate. The observation platform extended out over the cliff, offering what should have been a spectacular sunset view. Instead, the ocean looked wrong. The water wasn't moving correctly, too still in some places, churning in others without any apparent pattern. And the horizon seemed closer somehow, as if the ocean had humped up, preparing to roll forward. My phone buzzed again. This time I read the full alert. Unprecedented tidal anomaly detected. All coastal residents must evacuate immediately. This is not a tsunami warning. Repeat, this is not a tsunami. Nature of threat unknown. Not a tsunami. Then what? A sound made me turn. Footsteps on the wooden platform. A woman emerged from the mist, moving with an odd, listing gait. Her clothes were soaked despite the lack of rain, and as she came closer, I could see kelp tangled in her hair. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but only a clicking sound emerged, like shells rattling in a jar. Her eyes weren't focused on me, but on something past me, something out in the water. I followed her gaze and saw lights beneath the surface. Not the phosphorescence I knew from night surfing, but something steadier, more deliberate. They pulsed in a pattern that seemed almost like communication. The woman clicked again, louder this time, and started walking toward the platform's edge. I called out, but she didn't respond, didn't even slow. She reached the railing and began climbing over it with mechanical precision. I lunged forward, grabbing her arm. Her skin was cold, far too cold, and slick with something that wasn't just seawater. She turned to look at me then, and her eyes reflected those underwater lights, as if they were somehow inside her, looking out. She pulled free with surprising strength and continued over the railing. I heard no splash, no impact. When I looked over the edge, there was only darkness, and those pulsing lights, now arranged in what looked disturbingly like a pathway leading into deeper water. More footsteps. I spun around to see figures emerging from multiple directions, from the parking area, from the coastal trail, even from behind the shuttered visitor center. All moving with that same unnatural gait, all soaking wet despite the dry evening, all heading for the platform's edge. A man in a business suit, kelp wrapped around his neck like a tie. A jogger, her running shoes squeaking with each step, leaving puddles of something darker than water. An elderly couple, holding hands, their fingers intertwined with seaweed. They float around me as if I weren't there, clicking and gurgling in what might have been communication, or might have been the sound of waterlogged lungs trying to breathe. One by one, they climbed over the railing and disappeared into the darkness below. No screams, no splashes, just a procession of the damned or the chosen. I couldn't tell which. I backed away, my hands shaking as I tried to process what I was seeing. The rational part of my brain scrambled for explanations. Mass hallucination, chemical spill, some kind of toxic algae bloom affecting everyone's behavior. But the drag marks, the kelp patterns, the lights beneath the water, they suggested something far more intentional. My phone erupted with alerts, the screen filling faster than I could read. Pacific Coastal Highway closed. Multiple missing persons. Do not approach the water. Do not listen to the sound. The sound. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I couldn't unhear it. A low thrumming that seemed to come from the ocean itself. A frequency that bypassed my ears and went straight to my bones. It was almost musical, almost like voices, almost like words in a language that predated human speech. I ran, stumbled back to my car, my keys fumbling in hands that suddenly felt too large, too clumsy. The engine started on the third try, and I reversed hard, tires screaming against the damp asphalt. As I sped away, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror. More figures walking steadily toward the platform, emerging from cars I hadn't noticed before, from hiding spots, from nowhere. The drive back was a blur of emergency vehicles heading the opposite direction, their lights painting the mist in alternating reds and blues. The radio had gone to full emergency broadcast, reporters struggling to describe something they clearly didn't understand. Mass disappearances along the coast, people walking into the ocean, boats found empty, their crews vanished, and everywhere, those drag marks, that kelp, signs of something having emerged from the water hours before the first person went missing. I made it inland, found a motel in some forgettable town where the desert started. The clerk looked at me strangely when I checked in. I must have looked wild, panicked. I didn't care. I locked the door, pushed a chair against it, and sat on the bed, watching the news coverage that made less sense with each update. The official story solidified over the next hours. A toxic spill, mass hysteria, evacuation successful, situation contained. But the footage they showed didn't match their words. Coast Guard boats circling areas where the water glowed. Hazmat teams backing away from something on the beach, something the camera carefully avoided showing. And in the background of one shot, just for a moment before the feed cut, I saw them. Hundreds of figures standing waist-deep in the surf, perfectly still, all facing the same direction, waiting. I haven't slept since then. Can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that thrumming, feel it calling. My skin has been dry all day, unusually dry, and I've drunk more water in the last 12 hours than I usually do in 3 days. When I shower, I stand under the spray far longer than necessary, and when I finally force myself to get out, I feel incomplete. The marks started appearing this morning, faint lines on my arms that look almost like scales if you catch them in the right light. The doctor said it was stress, gave me a cream, told me to rest. But I know better. I can feel it growing stronger. That pull toward the coast, toward the water, toward whatever made those lights beneath the waves. I've been searching for similar events throughout history. They're there if you look. Coastal villages found empty, ships discovered with no crew but signs of something having come aboard, mass disappearances blamed on storms that never happened. We've always explained them away, rationalized them, forgotten them. But what if they were all the same thing? What if something has always been there, waiting, occasionally calling, and we just got better at not listening? My phone buzzes. Another alert. But this one's different. Not from the emergency system. The screen shows only an image. A view from underwater, looking up at the surface, at silhouettes standing at the edge of a platform. One silhouette is circled in red. It's me. It's a photo of me from below, from the ocean, from that night. The thrumming is getting louder. My skin is so dry it's beginning to crack, and underneath, something glistens. The motel is 60 miles from the ocean, but I can smell salt. I can hear waves. I can feel the tide pulling, always pulling. I'm going to try to sleep again, but I know what will happen. I'll dream of water, of pressure, of swimming down toward lights that pulse in patterns I'm beginning to understand. And when I wake, if I wake, I'll be closer to the coast. My car keys will be in my hand. The engine will be running. They're not taking people. That's what I've finally understood. They're calling them home. The bathroom faucet is dripping. Each drop sounds like a word in that impossible language. I should fix it. I should leave. I should do anything but listen. But I'm listening. God help me. I'm listening. And it's starting to make sense. Story 2. The French Quarter never truly sleeps, but at 3:11 a.m. it holds its breath. I discovered this truth 3 weeks into my lease at the converted loft on Dauphine Street, though I should have recognized the signs earlier. The landlord's nervous laughter when handing over the keys. The way delivery drivers refused to climb the narrow stairs after sunset. The previous tenant's mail still arriving, always marked return to sender, in different handwriting each time. But the rent was reasonable for the quarter, and the exposed brick walls held that authentic patina of age that developers tried desperately to recreate in newer buildings. Besides, I needed distance from everything I'd left behind in Chicago. The divorce papers, the empty apartment, the weight of 43 years spent building a life that collapsed in 6 months. The loft sprawled across the building's 3rd floor, its windows overlooking a courtyard where banana trees grew wild between crumbling statuary. During daylight, jazz from street musicians drifted through the shutters. At night, the only sounds were settling wood and the occasional drunk tourist stumbling past. The space came furnished, a blessing since I'd arrived with only 2 suitcases and a laptop bag. The furniture bore that particular heaviness of antiques. A mahogany bed frame that required 3 men to move, a wardrobe that smelled of cedar and something else I couldn't identify, and an ornate floor mirror positioned opposite the bed. That mirror troubled me from the beginning. 7 feet tall, framed in tarnished silver, it reflected the room with subtle distortions that made distances seem wrong. The bed appeared farther away than it should. The ceiling seemed to press lower, but old mirrors warp. I told myself this whenever I caught my reflection moving a fraction of a second too late. The first incident happened on a Tuesday. I woke at 3:11 a.m. to absolute silence. Not the normal quiet of night, but a vacuum where sound should exist. My phone, charging on the nightstand, displayed a dead black screen despite being plugged in all evening. The bedside lamp clicked uselessly when I tried the switch. In the darkness, something drew my attention to the mirror. A Trilby hat hung from its upper corner, the felt brim casting a shadow that shouldn't exist without light. I don't own a Trilby. I've never owned any hat beyond a baseball cap lost years ago. Yet there it perched, dark gray or black, hard to tell in the gloom, with a narrow silk band that seemed to absorb what little illumination filtered through the shutters. I sat up, sheets twisted around my legs, waiting for my eyes to adjust, for the shape to resolve into something logical, a trick of shadow. Clothes draped oddly, anything but an impossible hat. Then 3 knocks echoed through the loft, deliberate, measured, coming from inside the wardrobe. By the time I fumbled for my phone's flashlight function, suddenly working again, battery at 73%, the hat had vanished. The wardrobe stood silent and innocuous. I spent the remaining hours until dawn convinced I'd experienced some vivid hypnagogic hallucination, the kind that occurs between sleep and waking. Stress from the move. Too much coffee, the unfamiliar sounds of a new place. But it happened again the next night, and the next. Always at 3:11 a.m., always preceded by that suffocating silence. My electronics would die, phone, laptop, even my analog watch would stop, and the Trilby would materialize on the mirror. Some nights it hung from the left corner, others from the right. Once I found it balanced perfectly on top of the frame, defying physics with its stillness. The 3 knocks followed, though their source varied. The wardrobe, the bathroom door, the floorboards directly beneath my bed. I tried documenting the phenomena. Set up my phone to record all night, only to find the files corrupted, showing nothing but static between 3:10 and 3:12 a.m. Invited a colleague from the community college where I'd found adjunct work to stay over, but he spent the night snoring peacefully while I watched the hat appear, unable to wake him no matter how hard I shook his shoulder. Attempted staying awake through the appointed hour, only to find myself mysteriously unconscious at 3:10, waking at 3:12 with the taste of copper in my mouth and the absolute certainty that someone had been standing over me. Research into the building's history revealed nothing unusual. No murders, no suicides, no tragic histories beyond the standard New Orleans narrative of yellow fever and occasional flooding. The previous tenant, I learned from the downstairs neighbor, had been a jazz musician who simply stopped paying rent one day and disappeared. She mentioned this while refusing to make eye contact, her fingers worrying at a St. Christopher pendant around her neck. By the second week, the phenomena escalated. The hat no longer disappeared at 3:12. Instead, it would remain until I physically removed it from the mirror, the felt leaving marks on my fingertips like ash or very fine dust. This dust had a peculiar quality. It wouldn't wash off with soap and water, but would fade on its own within hours, leaving my skin feeling raw and too sensitive, as if I'd been lightly burned. The power failures expanded beyond the witching hour. Lights would flicker when I passed the mirror. My laptop would restart randomly, opening to websites I hadn't visited, genealogy databases, obituaries from the 1920s, articles about hat-making techniques from the previous century. The search history showed queries I hadn't made. Trilby versus fedora identification, mirror portal theory, possession through reflected objects. Then came the night I saw myself wearing it. I'd grown accustomed to avoiding the mirror's direct gaze after dark, but movement in my peripheral vision made me turn. My reflection stood there, perfectly normal, except for the Trilby perched at a rakish angle on my head. I raised my hand to my bare scalp. Nothing there, while my reflection adjusted the hat's brim with a gesture I'd never made. The reflection smiled. Not my smile. Something else wearing my face, using expressions my muscles didn't know how to form. I stumbled backward, knocking over the bedside lamp. In the brief chaos of falling ceramic and flickering light, I glimpsed something else in the mirror. Not my room, but another space. Similar, yet wrong. The walls were the same exposed brick, but covered in water stains that formed patterns like faces. The bed existed, but appeared recently abandoned, its sheets twisted into forms suggesting struggle. And standing beside it, partially obscured by shadow, a figure in a dark suit and trilby hat, facing away from the mirror. When the lamp struck the floor and shattered, darkness rushed back. My phone illuminated moments later. 3:12 a.m. exactly. The mirror reflected only my terrified face and disheveled room. Sleep became impossible after that. I tried covering the mirror with a sheet, but it would slip off during the night. Attempted turning it to face the wall, only to wake and find it restored to its original position. The landlord claimed no knowledge of anyone entering the apartment, suggested I might be sleepwalking, and reminded me that breaking the lease would forfeit my substantial deposit. The dust from the hat began appearing elsewhere. Fingerprints on the bathroom mirror that weren't mine. The whorls and ridges facing the wrong direction, as if someone had touched the glass from the other side. Footprints across the hardwood floor, leading from the mirror to my bed, visible only in the afternoon light when the sun hit at the right angle. Always the left foot slightly turned inward, a gait I didn't recognize. I installed a doorbell camera inside the apartment, positioned to watch the mirror. The footage revealed nothing during the crucial minute, just static and darkness, but in the moments before, I could see myself sleeping. And something else. A shadow that didn't match any object in the room. It grew more distinct each night, gaining definition and form. By the fifth night of recording, it had become almost human-shaped, standing just outside the mirror's reflection, waiting. Last night changed everything. I'd finally decided to leave, deposit be damned. Packed my suitcases, booked a morning flight home to Chicago. Better the familiar misery than this escalating wrongness. At 3:10 a.m., I sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, car keys in hand, determined to wait out the phenomena one final time before fleeing. The silence arrived as always, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. The trilby materialized, hanging from the mirror's center this time, spinning slowly as if suspended on invisible thread, but this time, I noticed something new. Dust on the outside of the mirror, in the shape of a handprint, as if someone had pressed their palm against the glass from my side of the room. I approached despite every instinct screaming retreat, placed my hand over the dusty print. It was smaller than mine, the fingers shorter but broader. Old dust, I realized. Not from tonight, but from before. Maybe weeks, months, years before. How many others had stood here, touching this glass, trying to understand? That's when I saw it clearly in the reflection. The figure in the trilby hat, no longer turned away but facing the mirror from that other room. Not a stranger's face, but mine. Older, perhaps, or just worn down by something I couldn't name. He raised his hand to match mine on the glass, and I felt the cold through the mirror, impossible, but undeniable. He spoke, though his lips didn't move, the words appearing in my mind like remembered lyrics. You're already wearing it. You've always been wearing it. Every tenant wears it, in the end. I jerked my hand back, but the dust remained on my palm, forming into patterns that looked almost like letters, a message I couldn't quite read. The other me, or whatever wore my face, tipped his trilby and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of that reflected room. The hat still hangs on the mirror as I write this. It's 4:47 a.m. now, and the normal sounds of night have returned. Sirens in the distance, a cat yowling in the courtyard, the building's bones settling into their familiar rhythm. But I know something has changed. When I look at my reflection, there's a shadow on my head that doesn't match anything in the room. A weight I can almost feel, growing more substantial with each passing hour. The dust on my palm has formed into words now, though they keep shifting when I try to read them directly. The only constant is a date, 1923. I found that date in my mysterious search history, connected to a haberdasher's shop that once occupied this building's ground floor. The owner vanished one night, leaving behind his entire inventory except for one item, a gray trilby with a black silk band, never found despite extensive searching. I should leave. Drive to the airport right now, board that plane, never look back. But I find myself sitting here, staring at the mirror, waiting for 3:11 a.m. to come around again. Tomorrow night, and the night after. The hat is patient. It's waded through dozens of tenants, maybe hundreds. In the mirror, my reflection adjusts something on its head that I still can't see from this side. Not yet. But I'm beginning to understand that moving won't matter. The trilby isn't bound to this place. It's bound to whoever sees it, acknowledges it, touches its dust. I carry it with me now, a weight that exists in reflections before it exists in reality. Every mirror will become that mirror. Every witching hour will bring those 3 knocks, getting louder, more insistent, until I answer, until I put it on, or until I realize I already have. The dust on my palm has finally settled into readable text. It's not a message, but a question, written in handwriting I'm starting to recognize as my own. Which side of the mirror are you on? I don't know anymore. I'm not sure I ever did. The trilby hangs there, waiting, and I can feel its weight growing heavier on my head with each word I type. When I look at my laptop screen's black reflection, I'm wearing it. When I glance at my phone, it's there. Every surface that holds my image shows the truth that my eyes can't yet see. Maybe that's what the 3 knocks mean. Not a warning or a haunting, but a question repeated each night. Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? Tonight, I think I'll answer. Story 3. The notification pinged at 2:47 a.m., cutting through the stale air of my idling Camry. Premium ride, triple surge pricing, cash payment authorized. My finger hovered over the accept button, while Detroit's empty streets stretched before me like veins on a corpse's hand. 3 months of driving nights had taught me to trust my gut, and right now my gut was twisting itself into knots I couldn't name. I accepted anyway. Rent was due in 4 days. The pickup location appeared on my screen, a warehouse district 20 minutes northeast, where the city's industrial skeleton stood against the darkness. No street number, just GPS coordinates. The passenger's name showed as a single letter, K. The destination field remained blank, marked only with "will provide on arrival." Everything about it screamed wrong, but the payout. The payout would cover my groceries for 2 weeks. My headlights carved through the October fog as I drove, the radio crackling with static between stations. The city thinned around me, residential blocks giving way to chain-link fences and abandoned lots. Street lamps became scarce, then non-existent. My phone's screen provided the only consistent light besides my high beams, its blue glow making my hands look bloodless on the steering wheel. The GPS led me deeper into the industrial maze. Left here, right there, another left. The turns came too frequently, doubling back on themselves in patterns that made no sense. I'd driven these streets before, had to have in 3 months of nights, but nothing looked familiar. Every corrugated metal wall, every loading dock, every shattered window seemed both foreign and hauntingly recognizable, like déjà vu running in reverse. The destination marker pulsed on my screen, indicating arrival, though I saw nothing but a row of identical warehouses, their facades as blank as closed eyes. Then movement. A figure stepping from a recessed doorway, hand raised. Tall, wearing what looked like an expensive overcoat despite the mild weather. Face obscured by shadow and distance. I rolled down my window halfway. The autumn air carried the taste of rust and old motor oil. The figure approached with measured steps, stopping just outside the cone of my headlights. Male, I thought, though I couldn't be certain. The coat looked black or maybe deep blue. Colors were tricky in this light. "You're early," the voice said, smooth and oddly cheerful. Not what I expected from someone seeking rides at this hour in this place. "That's good. That's very good." My hands tightened on the wheel. Something in the voice's cadence felt practiced, like lines from a play performed one too many times. The figure gestured toward the warehouse behind him, its entrance a rectangle of absolute darkness. "Just need you to pull inside and wait, 5 minutes, maybe 10. Easy money." The smart response would be to drive away. Every safety video, every driver forum, every instinct screamed against entering enclosed spaces with passengers. But the figure pulled out a roll of bills, thick enough to cast its own shadow, fanning them slightly in the dim light. Double the app price for the inconvenience. Cash up front. I found myself shifting into drive, following the figure's directing hands toward the warehouse entrance. The doorway swallowed my car whole. Darkness so complete my headlights seemed to shrink rather than penetrate it. Inside, the space opened into vastness. I could feel it more than see it. The way sound changed, the way the air moved. My lights illuminated only a small circle of oil-stained concrete and nothing beyond. The figure appeared at my window again, having moved with impossible silence. This close, I still couldn't make out facial features, just the suggestion of a smile. He handed me the cash through the window more than promised, the bills crisp and somehow cold. Just wait here. Keep the engine running. Don't turn around, no matter what you hear. Before I could respond, he melted back into the darkness. Not walked, melted, as if the shadows were liquid, and he was soluble in them. My heart hammered against my ribs. I counted the money twice, 3 times, using the repetitive motion to calm my nerves. Real bills, real serial numbers, real enough to make this worth it, I told myself. That's when my phone started acting wrong. The GPS display flickered, the warehouse interior suddenly populating with streets that couldn't exist. Arrows appeared, pointing in directions that defied the walls I knew surrounded me. Turn left in 50 feet. Turn right in 20 feet. Make a U-turn. The voice navigation activated without prompting, its tone distorted, speaking in fragments. Recalculating. Proceed to. Recalculating. You have arrived. Recalculating. Then the messages started. Unknown number. No caller ID. The first one made my blood freeze. Nice jacket. The brown leather one. Looks warm. I looked down at my jacket. The brown leather one I'd bought secondhand last winter. My windows were up. The warehouse was dark. No one could see me. Another message. You missed a spot shaving. Left side of your neck. My hand flew involuntarily to my neck, finding the rough patch I'd rushed over this morning. The darkness outside my window seemed to press closer, gaining weight and substance. I could hear my own breathing, too fast, too shallow. The scar on your right hand. How old is it? I stared at the thin white line across my knuckles. A childhood accident I never talked about, barely visible even in good light. My phone screen flickered again, the GPS now showing my car in multiple locations simultaneously. Little blue dots scattered across an impossible map like scattered rice. The engine coughed, not a mechanical failure, something else, like it was choking on the darkness itself. The radio sparked to life, scanning through stations on its own, catching fragments of voices that sounded almost like mine but not quite. Never should have come here. They're watching. It's already too late. Movement in the rearview mirror made me violate the one rule I'd been given. I turned around. Nothing. Empty darkness. But the feeling of being watched intensified, like dozens of eyes had opened in the void. When I faced forward again, my windshield was fogged with condensation that hadn't been there seconds before. As I reached to wipe it, shapes appeared in the moisture. Handprints from the outside, pressing against the glass. Too many to count. Overlapping. Smearing. My phone buzzed. We like your car. We've always liked your car. That's when I heard the engines. Not one. Multiple. The synchronized hum of several vehicles idling in the darkness around me. My headlights, still managing their feeble cone of illumination, caught glimpses of chrome, bumpers, side mirrors, all at the wrong height, the wrong distance, as if the vehicles were suspended or the ground had different levels I couldn't perceive. Another message. Check your mirrors. I didn't want to. Every fiber of my being resisted. But my eyes moved anyway, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. In the driver's side mirror, illuminated by some impossible light source, I saw another Camry. Same model, same year, same color, same rideshare decals on the windshield. The license plate was partially visible. The first 3 letters matched mine. The passenger mirror showed the same thing. Another clone of my car, positioned perfectly parallel. My rear-view mirror, when I dared to check, revealed a third, or maybe the same one. Or maybe they were all the same one, reflected infinitely in space that shouldn't exist. Start driving. The message appeared without a notification sound. I looked at the warehouse entrance, or where it should have been. Solid wall now. No sign of the doorway I'd driven through. My GPS showed arrows pointing in every direction at once, overlapping into a starburst of possibilities. The other engines revved in perfect synchronization with mine, though I hadn't touched the accelerator. My car began moving without my input, following GPS directions I couldn't read, turning through spaces that couldn't exist. The speedometer showed 0. The sensation of movement was undeniable. In my peripheral vision, the other cars moved in perfect parallel, maintaining exact distances, their headlights creating a constellation of lights that made no geometric sense. Were there 3? 5? A dozen? The number changed each time I tried to count, like they were cycling through positions, trading places in a dance I couldn't follow. My phone rang. Unknown number. My hand answered without my permission, bringing it to my ear. The voice was mine, but wrong, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. Take the next left. I heard myself respond, though my mouth didn't move. There is no left. There's always been a left. You've taken it before. The steering wheel turned under my hands. The warehouse interior had become something else, corridors of concrete and shadow that extended beyond reason. My headlights showed glimpses of other passages, other turns, branching fractally into infinity. And in each possible path, another set of headlights, another Camry, another version of this moment happening simultaneously. Time became elastic. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m. Still. Always. I'd been driving for hours or seconds. Both true, neither true. The fuel gauge hadn't moved. The odometer spun backward, forward, stopped, spun again. More messages flooded my phone, too fast to read. The screen a blur of text that hurt to perceive directly. I caught fragments. Never left. Always been here. We needed one more. Your turn to wait. The radio crackled. Next pickup in 5 minutes. Premium ride. Triple surge. Accept. The voice was mine. Had always been mine. I remembered accepting. Would accept. Was accepting now. A figure appeared in my headlights. Tall, wearing an expensive overcoat. It raised its hand, and I saw my own watch on its wrist, the one with the cracked face I'd been meaning to fix. The figure's face remained obscured, but I knew if I got closer, if the light hit just right, I would see. I slammed the brakes. The other cars stopped in perfect synchronization, their brake lights creating a red constellation in the impossible space. The figure didn't move, hand still raised, waiting with infinite patience. My phone buzzed. Complete the pickup. I wanted to refuse. Every part of me that still felt like myself wanted to throw the car in reverse, to break the pattern, to escape whatever this was. But my hands were already shifting to drive. My foot was already easing off the brake. Because I remembered now. Remembered accepting this same ride before. Remembered the warehouse, the darkness, the other cars. Remembered becoming one of them, waiting in the shadows for the next driver to arrive. Remembered forgetting, starting my shift fresh, seeing the premium ride notification. The figure approached my window. This close, illuminated by the dome light that activated without me touching it, I saw its face clearly. It wasn't my face. That would have been too simple, too comprehensible. It was the absence of a face, a void shaped like features, as if someone had cut a person-shaped hole in reality and forgot to fill it with anything. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere except its non-mouth. 5 minutes, maybe 10. Easy money. My hand was already extending the cash I'd been given. When? Tonight? Every night? The bills felt cold and familiar. The figure that wasn't quite me and wasn't quite anything took them with fingers that bent in too many places. Just wait here. Keep the engine running. Don't turn around, no matter what you hear. I wanted to scream, to warn myself, to break free, but I was already melting back into darkness, becoming one with the shadow substance of this place. My consciousness scattered across multiple cars, multiple moments, all happening now, all having happened, all about to happen. Somewhere, in another car, that was also this car, I watched myself check the rearview mirror, watched myself see the other vehicles, watched myself begin to drive through impossible spaces. The cycle continuing, had continued, would continue. My phone, all our phones, buzzed with a final message. Thank you for accepting this ride. Your driver will arrive in, always. The warehouse doors opened, though they'd never been closed. Detroit's night stretched beyond, but wrong. Too many streets, too many paths, all leading back here. Every route a mirror route, every pickup the same pickup, every driver becoming the passenger becoming the driver. I drove out into the city that was and wasn't Detroit, following GPS directions to my next pickup, knowing where it would lead, unable to stop. In my mirrors, the other cars followed. Perfect reproductions down to the rideshare stickers, the license plates that almost matched, the drivers with familiar faces I couldn't quite see. The radio crackled with static that sounded like laughter or crying or both. Premium ride available. Triple surge pricing. Accept? My finger was already moving toward the screen. Had always been moving. Would always be moving. I accepted. The notification ping echoed through all our cars at once. 2:47 a.m. sharp, cutting through the stale air of eternity. Story 4. The metallic scraping against my door handle wasn't what woke me. It was the absence of sound that followed, a vacuum so complete it felt like the world had paused mid-breath. Through the gap beneath my door at the Cabo San Lucas resort, two shadows stood motionless, darker than the dimly lit hallway should have allowed. I pressed my eye to the peephole. A maintenance worker stood there, his badge flipped backward against his chest, hands gripping a cleaning cart that looked wrong. Where laundry bags should hang, a rigid case sat alone, its surface reflecting the hallway lights in ways that made my eyes water. The man didn't move like staff should move. He stood there for exactly 60 seconds, I counted, his head tilted at an angle that made my neck ache in sympathy. The cart's wheels squeaked as he finally pushed it away, but the sound came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing in frequencies that shouldn't exist in a narrow hallway. I waited another 5 minutes before venturing out, my bare feet silent on the carpet that felt damp despite looking dry. Downstairs, the breakfast area buzzed with the forced cheerfulness of vacationers, but something was off about their movements, too synchronized, like a choreographed scene playing on loop. The abandoned cleaning cart sat near the elevator, empty now, its metal frame gleaming with condensation that couldn't exist in this dry heat. Wheel tracks led to room 447, where the door hung open at an impossible angle, its hinges intact but somehow wrong. I approached slowly, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The track stopped exactly at the threshold, as if the cart had simply ceased to exist upon crossing. Inside, the room appeared untouched, except for the bed, where the sheets formed precise geometric patterns no human hands could create. The air tasted of copper and ozone. My phone buzzed. A message from the front desk informed me that housekeeping would service my room at 11 a.m. It was 10:47. I hadn't given them my number. Back in my room, I wedged a chair under the door handle and watched the clock. At 10:59, the temperature dropped 15 degrees in seconds. My breath misted as footsteps approached. Not from the hallway, but from inside my walls, circling counterclockwise. The doorknob turned despite the chair. The metal groaned but held. Through the peephole, the same worker stood there, his badge now facing forward but the text constantly shifting, never quite readable. Behind him, the cart had returned, but the rigid case was open, revealing a darkness that seemed to pull at my vision. He knocked 3 times, each impact reverberating through my skeleton. When I didn't answer, he spoke, though his lips never moved. The words came from the air conditioning vents, the bathroom drain, the gaps between the floorboards. He said housekeeping was mandatory. He said I'd already agreed. He said the other guests had been so cooperative. I grabbed my passport and wallet, leaving everything else behind. The hallway stretched longer than it should, doors multiplying as I passed. Some stood open, revealing rooms where cleaning carts sat abandoned, their rigid cases yawning wide. In one, I glimpsed another guest standing perfectly still, eyes open but reflecting nothing, while a figure in a maintenance uniform carefully adjusted their posture like arranging a mannequin. The elevator took 17 minutes to travel 3 floors. When the doors opened to the lobby, half the guests stood in a perfect grid pattern, all facing the reception desk. They breathed in unison, a rhythmic whisper that sounded like static. The concierge smiled at me with too many teeth, asking if I'd enjoyed my stay, using my name though I'd never told her. Outside, the noon sun cast shadows that fell upward. Taxis lined the entrance, but their drivers sat motionless, hands at 10 and 2, eyes fixed on nothing. I started walking, then running, my feet burning on asphalt that felt soft, yielding like flesh. 3 blocks away, I turned back. The resort looked normal from here, palm trees swaying, tourists laughing by the pool. But the windows were wrong. In every single one, the same figure stood, holding the same cleaning cart, watching me with the same backward badge. I booked a flight home immediately, paying cash at the airport. During the wait, I noticed other travelers with the same haunted look, the same compulsive checking over shoulders. We didn't speak, but we recognized each other. Refugees from hotels, motels, resorts. Places where the cleaning staff had stopped pretending to clean. The plane lifted off, and I thought I was free. Then the flight attendant pushed her cart down the aisle, and I saw it. The same rigid case where drinks should be. She paused at my row, her badge mysteriously backward, asking if I needed anything. Her smile never wavered as she stood there for exactly 60 seconds. I said no. She moved on, but I could hear her cart's wheels squeaking in that impossible frequency, feel the temperature dropping around me. The passenger beside me had fallen asleep, his breathing too regular, too mechanical. When I looked closer, his eyes were open behind closed lids, reflecting a darkness I recognized. We landed in Houston, but the airport felt wrong. Too many cleaning carts in the terminals, too many maintenance workers with backward badges. They moved through the crowds like sharks through water, always peripheral, always watching. The bathroom mirrors showed their reflections even when they weren't there. I drove home instead of taking another flight, 16 hours straight, stopping only for gas and paying cash. My apartment building looked the same, but the doorman was new. His uniform was too clean, his movements too precise. He welcomed me back using a name that wasn't quite mine. Syllables shifted just enough to sound alien. Inside my apartment, everything sat exactly as I'd left it, except for the thin layer of dust that formed patterns. Geometric, intentional. My phone had 37 missed calls from numbers that didn't exist. The voicemails were just that squeaking sound, growing louder with each message. I stopped sleeping on the 3rd night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear cartwheels in the walls. The neighbors complained about noise from my unit while I was out. Sounds of furniture being rearranged, metal scraping against door frames. The building's security footage showed my door opening and closing, but nothing passing through. A week later, I woke to find a cleaning cart in my living room. I hadn't slept, hadn't closed my eyes, but there it was. The rigid case open, revealing that hungry darkness. No one had entered. The door remained locked, deadbolted, chained. The cart simply existed where it hadn't before. I left everything behind again. Changed cities, changed names, paid cash for everything. But hotels exist everywhere. Cleaning staff exist everywhere. And now I see them clearly. Not just in hospitality, but in offices, schools, hospitals. Always with their backward badges, their wrong-angled movements, their carts that hold impossible spaces. Sometimes I wonder if I ever left that resort in Cabo. Maybe I'm still in room 447, standing perfectly still while someone adjusts my posture. Maybe the running, the fear, the constant movement. Maybe that's the dream, and the stillness is real. The knock at my current motel door comes at 11 p.m. sharp. I don't need to look to know what's there. A cleaning cart, a backward badge, 60 seconds of waiting. They're getting bolder, no longer pretending to be subtle. The metal scraping has become almost musical, a symphony of intrusion. I've met others like me in late-night diners and 24-hour laundromats. People who can't stop moving, can't stop checking over their shoulders. We share the same story with different details, different resorts, different cities, but always the carts, always the backward badges, always that rigid case holding darkness. One woman claimed she'd found a pattern. They only take people who notice them. The moment you see past their disguise, you're marked. But by then, it's too late. You can't unsee the wrongness, can't stop noticing how they move through spaces that shouldn't connect, how they clean rooms that were never dirty, how they service lives that were never lived. I've started leaving notes for whoever finds my things. Warnings about the cleaning carts, the backward badges, the 60-second waits. But the notes disappear, replaced by hotel stationery with messages in my handwriting that I never wrote, thanking housekeeping for their excellent service. The walls in this motel are thin. I can hear my neighbors breathing in unison, that mechanical rhythm I recognize too well. Their doors open and close at synchronized intervals. Soon, they'll stand in the hallway in a perfect grid, all facing my door, while someone with a backward badge adjusts their positions. I keep moving, but the world is getting smaller. Every place has cleaning staff. Every building needs maintenance. And somewhere, in a resort in Cabo San Lucas, room 447 stays empty, its door hanging at that impossible angle, waiting for me to come back and take my place among the others who stopped running. The knock comes again. This time I don't count to 60, or 2. This time I open the door. Story 5. The move to Chicago was supposed to be a fresh start, but some stains follow you no matter how far you run. I learned this 3 months into my new life, when the familiar weight of being watched settled back onto my shoulders like an old coat I thought I'd thrown away. The studio apartment sat on the 3rd floor of a converted brick building in Lincoln Park, its single window facing west toward the elevated tracks. The realtor had called it cozy and authentic, which I quickly discovered meant cramped, and the radiator sounds like someone slowly strangling a cat. But it was mine, and after the mess I'd left behind in Portland, having something that belonged only to me felt like a small miracle. The first sign should have been the coffee recommendations. I'd been grabbing my morning caffeine from the same corner shop for 2 weeks when I found the note tucked under my apartment door. Plain white paper, neat handwriting in blue ink. The place on Halsted makes better espresso. Trust me. No signature, no explanation. I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash, attributing it to some overly friendly neighbor trying to be helpful. But the coffee at the Halsted place was incredible. The second note arrived 4 days later. They close early on Sundays. Try the pastries before noon. Again, the same careful script, the same unmarked paper. This time, curiosity won over caution. I asked the barista if she knew who might have recommended the place. She shrugged, steam hissing from the espresso machine behind her, and said she'd never seen anyone matching my description asking about new customers. The pastries were gone by 12:15. I started paying attention then, the way you do when the back of your neck begins to itch for no apparent reason. Walking home from work, I'd catch myself scanning doorways and checking reflections in store windows. The city's rhythm felt different somehow, as if someone had adjusted the tempo just slightly offbeat. Footsteps seemed to echo mine too closely on empty sidewalks. Conversations would pause when I passed, then resume in whispers I couldn't quite catch. The third note arrived on a Tuesday. The Indian place delivers until 2 a.m. Perfect for late nights when you can't sleep. I hadn't told anyone about my insomnia. The building's security was minimal, a temperamental buzzer system, and a lock that required more faith than force to operate. I started checking the hallways before leaving my apartment, listening for movement on the other side of my door before opening it. The carpet in the corridor was thin and stained, the kind that amplified every footfall. But lately I'd been hearing steps that didn't match any pattern of the other tenants. Mrs. Chen from 2B left for her nursing shift at precisely 6:47 a.m., her sensible shoes clicking against the linoleum in a steady rhythm. The graduate student in 3A stumbled out around 10, usually hungover, his sneakers scuffing and sliding. The couple on the first floor argued in muffled Spanish every evening around 7, their voices rising and falling like tide against distant rocks. But sometimes, in the spaces between these familiar sounds, I heard something else. Careful footsteps that paused outside my door just long enough for me to wonder if I'd imagined them. The soft whisper of paper against wood that meant another note had arrived. Your laundry schedule is too predictable. The gym on Clark Street has better equipment. You left your bedroom light on again. Each message felt like a violation, an intimate knowledge of my habits that no casual observer should possess. I changed my routines, varying my paths to work, switching between different grocery stores, taking the blue line instead of the brown, then the red instead of the blue. Nothing helped. The notes kept coming, each one more specific than the last. The new route takes you past the construction on Lincoln. Be careful of the loose scaffolding. Your mother called while you were in the shower. She sounded worried. The last one made my hands shake as I read it. I'd missed a call from my mother that morning, found the voicemail when I got out of the bathroom. She'd been concerned about my silence, wondering if I was eating enough, sleeping enough, taking care of myself in the big city. I hadn't told anyone in Chicago about my family, hadn't given my address to anyone who might know my mother's voice. I started staying late at work, using the office's Wi-Fi to research private investigators and security companies. The thought of involving the police felt premature. What would I tell them? That someone was giving me helpful advice about coffee shops and warning me about construction hazards? That I felt watched but had never actually seen anyone watching? The research led me down rabbit holes of urban surveillance techniques, stalking behaviors, and elaborate pranks. I learned about GPS tracking devices small enough to hide in coat pockets, about how social media location data could reveal patterns invisible to the person being tracked. I checked my clothes, my bag, my laptop case. I combed through my online presence, tightening privacy settings and deleting old posts. I even called my credit card company to check for unusual transactions. Everything appeared normal. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in late October, when the temperature dropped and the city's exhaled breath became visible in the air. I was walking home from the grocery store, arms full of bags, when I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. Not the purposeful stride of someone with a destination, but the careful, measured pace of someone trying to match another person's rhythm. I stopped abruptly in front of a shop window, pretending to examine the display of vintage books while watching the reflection behind me. For a moment, nothing. Then, 20 feet back, a figure in a dark coat stepped into a doorway. The motion was smooth, practiced, the movement of someone who'd done this many times before. My heart rate spiked, but I forced myself to continue walking normally. At the next corner, I turned suddenly, as if remembering something I'd forgotten, and doubled back. The sidewalk was empty, the doorway vacant, but the sensation of being observed intensified, crawling up my spine like cold fingers. I started taking different routes home, testing theories, trying to catch my watcher in the act. Sometimes I'd spot movement in my peripheral vision. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps that stopped when mine did. But whenever I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. Just the usual urban landscape of hurried commuters and illuminated storefronts, the ordinary chaos of people going about their lives. The notes became more frequent. You're getting paranoid. That's not healthy. The Thai restaurant on Armitage has cameras outside. Just so you know, your sleep patterns are getting worse. Try chamomile tea. Each message arrived without any sign of forced entry, without any disturbance to the building's routine. I started sleeping with a chair propped against my door, its legs squeaking against the hardwood at the slightest movement. I installed a motion-activated camera app on an old phone, pointing it at the hallway through my peephole. The footage showed nothing but empty corridors and the occasional neighbor passing by. But the notes kept coming. I began to question my own perception, wondering if the stress of the move and the isolation of living alone had affected my judgment. Maybe the notes were coincidences, helpful neighbors or building management trying to be friendly. Maybe the footsteps belonged to perfectly innocent people whose schedules happened to overlap with mine. Maybe the sensation of being watched was just the urban equivalent of phantom limb syndrome, the ghost of old anxieties manifesting in a new environment. Then came the photograph. Slipped under my door on a rainy Tuesday morning, it showed me standing at the bus stop outside my building. The angle suggested it had been taken from across the street, using a telephoto lens. I was checking my phone, unaware of the camera, completely natural and unposed. The timestamp in the corner indicated it had been taken 3 days earlier. I remembered that morning clearly. I'd been running late for a meeting, frustrated by the delayed bus, checking the transit app repeatedly for updates. The photo captured me in a moment of ordinary impatience, but seeing myself through someone else's lens felt like discovering I'd been living in a fishbowl without realizing it. This time I called the police. The officer who came to take my statement was younger than I'd expected, with tired eyes and the careful neutrality of someone who'd heard stranger stories. He examined the photograph, made notes about the previous incidents, asked about old relationships and workplace conflicts. His questions were thorough but routine, the sort of checklist designed to determine whether I was dealing with a genuine threat or my own imagination. In the end, he could only advise me to document everything, to install better locks, to be aware of my surroundings. The notes and photograph weren't explicitly threatening, he explained. Without evidence of trespassing or direct intimidation, there wasn't much the law could do. He gave me his card and suggested I call if the situation escalated. I spent the next week hyper-vigilant, cataloging every detail of my environment. I memorized the faces of regular commuters on my train, noted the schedules of delivery trucks in my neighborhood, documented the positions of security cameras along my routes. I carried pepper spray and kept my phone charged, ready to call for help at the first sign of direct contact. But the notes stopped coming. For 10 days, nothing. No mysterious advice, no evidence of surveillance, no sensation of being followed. The absence felt almost worse than the presence had, like waiting for a bomb to explode after hearing the timer start ticking. I found myself missing the notes, their strange intimacy, the proof that someone was paying attention to my existence in this vast, indifferent city. Then winter arrived in earnest, and with it, the night that changed everything. The temperature had dropped below freezing for the first time since I'd moved to Chicago, turning the city's breath into clouds of vapor that hung in the air like ghosts. I was coming home late from dinner with colleagues, my first social outing in weeks, feeling almost normal for the first time since the surveillance had begun. The Red Line train was nearly empty at that hour, just a handful of night shift workers and late commuters scattered among the orange plastic seats. I sat near the window, watching the city scroll past in ribbons of light and shadow, feeling the weight of weeks of tension finally beginning to lift from my shoulders. That's when I saw him. At first, it was just a vague sense of familiarity in my peripheral vision, the way you might notice a piece of furniture slightly out of place. But as the train rounded a curve and the car's fluorescent lights flickered, I caught sight of my reflection in the window and saw that I wasn't alone. The figure was seated 3 rows behind me, wearing a coat I recognized immediately. Dark wool, with distinctive silver buttons and a tear in the left sleeve that I'd never bothered to repair. It was the winter coat I'd donated to charity 6 months before leaving Portland, the one that had been my constant companion through 2 brutal Oregon winters. Seeing it again felt like encountering a ghost of my former life, but the wrongness went deeper than mere nostalgia. The person wearing the coat had their head down, face obscured by shadow, but their posture mirrored mine exactly. When I shifted in my seat, they shifted. When I turned my head slightly to get a better look, they turned theirs in perfect synchronization. My reflection in the window showed my growing panic, but it also showed something impossible. The figure behind me had no reflection of their own. I gripped the metal pole beside my seat, using its cold reality to anchor myself as the train lurched through another turn. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Trick of the light, exhaustion playing havoc with my perception, the stress of weeks of paranoia finally manifesting in hallucinations. But when I risked another glance, the figure was still there, still wearing my donated coat, still moving in perfect synchronization with my movements. The train began to slow as it approached my stop, and I felt a surge of panic at the thought of standing up, of turning around, of potentially coming face to face with whatever was sitting behind me. The other passengers began gathering their belongings, shuffling toward the doors with the weary efficiency of people who'd made this journey countless times before. I waited until the last possible moment before rising from my seat, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead as I moved toward the exit. The doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, and I stepped onto the platform with legs that felt unsteady beneath me. The cold air hit my face like a slap, and I turned immediately to look back at the train. The figure was standing in the doorway of the car, close enough now that I should have been able to see their face clearly. But the shadows beneath the hood of my old coat seemed to swallow light, creating a void where features should have been. They stood perfectly still as other passengers moved around them, as if they were a stone in a stream. Then the doors began to close. In the seconds before the train pulled away, the figure stepped forward, close enough that I could smell the familiar scent of the wool coat's fabric softener, could see the exact pattern of wear on the buttons. They leaned toward me, and despite the impossible darkness obscuring their face, I heard their voice with perfect clarity. They whispered my apartment's new gate code, the 6-digit number I'd programmed into the building's security system just that morning. The code I'd typed exactly once, alone in the building's lobby, with no one watching. The train pulled away, carrying the figure into the tunnel's darkness, leaving me standing alone on the platform with the echo of those whispered digits ringing in my ears. I walked home through streets that felt foreign despite 3 months of familiarity, every shadow seeming to harbor movement, every reflection in storefront windows showing scenes that didn't quite match reality. The gate code worked perfectly when I entered it, the lock clicking open with mechanical precision. In my apartment, I checked every window, every closet, every space large enough to hide a person. I called the building's management company and asked about the security system, learning that gate codes were generated randomly and stored only in the building's computer system. No one else should have known those numbers. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, staring at the door, waiting for another note to appear. None came. But as the sun rose and filled my apartment with pale morning light, I noticed something that made my hands shake as I reached for my coffee cup. On the hook beside my front door, where I always hung my current winter jacket, there was now a second coat, dark wool, with distinctive silver buttons and a tear in the left sleeve. The coat I'd donated 6 months ago, the one I'd seen on the train. It hung there as if it had always belonged in that space, as if it had simply come home after a long journey. The fabric still smelled like the fabric softener I'd used in Portland, still bore the subtle impressions of my body's shape in its folds. I reached out to touch it, then stopped, my hand hovering inches from the familiar material. Because if the coat was here, in my apartment, then what had I seen on the train? And more importantly, who had been wearing it? The morning light streaming through my window caught the coat's surface, making it shimmer slightly, and for just a moment, I could swear I saw the shadow of a figure standing within its folds, waiting patiently for me to put it on. The realtor had called it historically significant charm, but standing in the narrow hallway of my new Victorian home in Portland, I wondered if she'd meant historically significant problems. The built-in bookshelf dominated the wall between what would become my office and the living room, its dark mahogany shelves stretching from floor to ceiling like the ribs of some ancient beast. I'd bought the place sight unseen. A divorce settlement and a cross-country job transfer didn't leave much room for house-hunting luxuries. The previous owner had left in apparent haste, abandoning furniture, books, even personal photographs scattered throughout the rooms. The realtor mentioned something about an estate sale gone wrong, family disputes, but I hadn't pressed for details. The bookshelf bothered me from day one. Not its appearance. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each joint seamlessly fitted, but its placement. It interrupted the natural flow between rooms, creating an awkward bottleneck that forced you to turn sideways to pass. More than that, it felt wrong somehow, like a beautiful lie covering an ugly truth. On my third morning in the house, I decided it had to go. The shelf unit came away from the wall easier than expected, revealing not the drywall I'd anticipated, but a wooden panel, painted the same cream color as the adjacent walls, but clearly older. The paint had a different texture, slightly raised, as if applied over something that hadn't been properly sanded. I ran my fingers across the surface and felt the unmistakable ridges of writing beneath the paint. 2 hours with a heat gun and paint scraper revealed what someone had tried so hard to hide. The wood underneath was covered in pencil and charcoal markings, not random graffiti, but methodical notations. At the top, in careful block letters, room schedule, activity log. Below that, columns of information organized by location. Kitchen, 6:43 a.m., 12:17 p.m., 8:22 p.m. Footsteps, water running. Upstairs hall, 11:30 p.m., 2:17 a.m., 4:05 a.m., door sounds, breathing. Basement, 2:17 a.m., listening. Each entry was numbered, dated. The dates spanned 3 years, ending abruptly 6 months ago. Hundreds of observations, all in the same careful handwriting. The previous owner had been documenting something. Sounds, movements, patterns of activity throughout the house. At the bottom of the panel, in larger letters that looked hastily scrawled, "They know I'm watching. Moving to basement." That night, I dreamed of pencils scratching against wood, endless columns of numbers and times stretching into darkness. I woke at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of my own breathing, loud and harsh in the silence. The basement became my obsession over the following days. I'd avoided it initially, a typical Portland Victorian basement, low-ceilinged and perpetually damp, with stone foundation walls that wept moisture and cast strange shadows in the dim overhead lighting. But the notation on the panel kept drawing me back. Basement, 2:17 a.m., listening. I found the broom closet tucked beneath the stairs, a narrow space barely wide enough for cleaning supplies. Someone had installed a single bulb inside, the kind of harsh fluorescent that makes everything look sickly and wrong. And there, at exact eye level for someone my height, a thick chalk line ran horizontally across the back wall. Below it, in the same careful handwriting I'd seen upstairs, I learned to listen through the wood. I stared at the words, trying to make sense of them. Listen to what? The house creaked and settled like any old building, but nothing that seemed worth documenting with such obsessive precision. I reached out to touch the chalk, and it came away on my fingers, white and powdery. On impulse, I wiped the message away with my sleeve. The next morning, it was back. Not just back, thicker, bolder, as if drawn with more pressure, and below it, in fresh chalk, "Stay silent at 2:17. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, that stress from the move and divorce had scrambled my memory. I took photos with my phone this time before erasing both messages, documenting the exact position and thickness of each line. 24 hours later, the photos proved my sanity and destroyed my peace of mind. Both messages had returned, exactly as they'd been, plus a third line. "You're learning." That's when I started my own log. Day 4. Messages reappeared despite locked basement. House was secured all day while I was at work. No signs of forced entry. Changed locks anyway. Day 7. Heard footsteps in kitchen at 12:17 p.m. while in basement. Ran upstairs immediately. Kitchen empty. Coffee pot still warm, but I'd made coffee at 11 a.m. Day 10. Woke at 2:17 a.m. to complete silence. Not normal quiet. The absence of sound, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Lasted exactly 43 seconds. Day 14. Found new message in closet. "Do you hear them yet?" Tried staying in basement at 2:17 a.m. Heard scratching inside the walls like fingernails against wood, but only when perfectly still. The scratching became my focus. It was systematic, rhythmic, like Morse code tapped out with bone against timber. Always at 2:17 a.m., always lasting exactly 43 seconds. I timed it obsessively, recorded it on my phone, but the audio captured only my own breathing and the house's normal nighttime creaks. I began staying awake until 2:17, positioning myself in different rooms, trying to triangulate the source. The sound seemed to move. sometimes in the walls of my bedroom, sometimes behind the kitchen cabinets, sometimes so close it felt like it was inside my own skull. 3 weeks into my vigil, the pattern changed. Day 21. Scratching began at 2:17 but didn't stop at 2:18. Continued for 6 minutes. Pattern seemed deliberate. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Day 22. SOS pattern again, but faster, more urgent. New basement message. They know you're listening now. Day 25. Messages appearing daily now. Today's, don't let them know you understand. Scratching lasted 15 minutes. Definitely SOS. Repeated 127 times. I counted. The house felt different now, charged with an expectancy that made my skin crawl. Shadows fell wrong, pooling in corners where no shadows should exist. Reflections in windows showed movements that didn't match my own. The air itself seemed thicker, pressing against me like invisible hands. I started researching the house's history, diving into city records and newspaper archives. The Victorian had been built in 1887 by a lumber baron named Cornelius Blackwood. 5 families had owned it over the decades, each staying only a few years before selling suddenly. The most recent owner before me, the one who'd left behind the careful documentation, was listed as Dr. Edmund Pike, a retired professor of acoustics engineering. Pike had lived in the house for 3 years before disappearing 6 months ago. Not missing person, disappeared, legally disappeared, selling the house through a lawyer and relocating out of state without leaving a forwarding address. The realtor mentioned family disputes, but there was no family. Pike had been alone. Day 31. Found Pike's research hidden in basement ceiling tiles. Dozens of notebooks filled with acoustic measurements, sound mapping, frequency analysis. He'd been studying the house itself, its resonance patterns, the way sound traveled through its structure. Final entry. The house remembers every sound ever made within its walls, every footstep, every voice, every breath. It stores them in the wood like a phonograph cylinder. The scratching isn't random, it's playback. Day 33. Tried Pike's frequency detector app on my phone during 2:17 scratching. Device went haywire, readings jumping from inaudible low frequencies to the edge of human hearing. Sound isn't coming through the walls, it's coming from the walls. Day 37. No scratching at 2:17. Complete silence again, but longer this time, nearly 10 minutes. New basement message in red chalk. You've listened long enough. That night I made a decision that felt both inevitable and insane. I would spend the night in the basement closet, positioned exactly where Pike must have stood when he wrote his final message. If the house was some kind of acoustic storage device, if the walls themselves were a recording medium, then proximity to the source might reveal what Pike had discovered. I brought a camping chair, a thermos of coffee, and every recording device I could gather. Phone, tablet, an old cassette recorder I'd found in Pike's abandoned research. At 2 a.m. I sealed myself in the narrow closet and waited. The 17 minutes stretched like hours. I could hear my heartbeat, my breathing, the electric hum of the fluorescent bulb overhead. At exactly 2:17, the bulb flickered and died, plunging me into absolute darkness. The scratching began immediately, but it wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It surrounded me, above and below and on all sides, as if I were trapped inside a wooden box while something clawed its way in from outside. But there was pattern to it now, rhythm and intention, not SOS. Words, scratched out letter by letter in the darkness. Get out while you still can, they know you understand the house, remembers everything, every sound, every breath, every scream. The message repeated, faster each time, until the individual letters blurred into a continuous scraping that filled my skull like static. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, and in its white glare saw something that shattered the last of my rationality. The chalk messages on the wall were moving, rearranging themselves as I watched. Letters flowing like liquid, forming new words. You're part of the recording now. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and I didn't stop driving until Portland was 200 miles behind me. I checked into a motel and tried to convince myself I'd had some kind of breakdown, that stress and isolation had finally snapped my hold on reality. But the recording devices told a different story. Every single one had captured the same thing. 43 seconds of my own voice, whispering words I'd never spoken. I learned to listen through the wood. Stay silent at 2:17. They know you're listening now. 3 months later, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. No return address, postmarked from a town I'd never heard of in Oregon. Inside, a single photograph of my basement closet, taken from the exact position where I'd stood that final night. The chalk messages were gone, but new words had appeared, carved directly into the wood with what looked like fingernails. Thank you for your contribution to the collection. I've never been back to Portland, but sometimes, always at 2:17 a.m., I wake to the sound of scratching in the walls of whatever room I'm sleeping in. It follows me now, this acoustic haunting, this impossible storage device that Pike discovered and I somehow activated. The scratching spells out the same message every night, letter by letter. The house remembers everything. And in the silence that follows, I can hear my own voice whispering back from impossible distances, adding to the collection, part of the recording now and forever. Sometimes I wonder if Pike is still out there somewhere, listening to his own voice scratched into the walls of whatever new place he's found. Sometimes I wonder if that's what I'm destined for, an endless migration from house to house, each one learning to remember, each one adding my voice to its collection. But mostly, I just try not to listen. Because once you learn to hear the walls speak back, you can never unhear what they have to say. Story 7. The water off Key Largo holds secrets that daylight mercifully conceals. 23 years I've been leading night dives in these waters, and I thought I'd seen everything the darkness could offer. The bioluminescent plankton that paint trails of blue fire behind your fins, the nocturnal hunters that emerge from coral caves like ghosts, the way sound travels differently in the black, creating echoes where there should be none. But nothing had prepared me for what we encountered that humid August evening when the moon hung like a sliver of bone against the star-drunk sky. The group was smaller than usual, just 4 certified divers including myself. Jake, a retired Coast Guard veteran with steady hands and nerves to match. Red, whose actual name I'd forgotten years ago, but whose crimson beard made the nickname inevitable. And Tommy, barely 21 but already logging more bottom time than most instructors. Good divers, all of them. The kind who listened to briefings and followed protocols without question. I should have questioned the stillness of the surface that night. The water stretched flat as black glass in every direction, not a ripple disturbing its mirror-like perfection. Even the usual evening breeze had died to nothing, leaving the air thick and oppressive. The kind of calm that makes old salts nervous, though I couldn't articulate why at the time. Our boat, Meridian's Call, sat anchored over the edge of a steep drop-off where the continental shelf plunges into the Gulf Stream's ancient depths. Below us, the reef sloped from 30 feet down to infinite black, a landscape of coral formations that twisted into shapes the mind struggled to interpret in the wavering beam of dive lights. The pre-dive routine felt off from the beginning. My gear checks took longer than usual, my fingers fumbling with familiar buckles and valves. The others seemed affected too. Red kept adjusting his mask even though it sat perfectly, and Tommy's usual chatter had died to muttered equipment confirmations. Only Jake appeared unaffected, but even he kept glancing over the side of the boat as if expecting to see something rise from the depths. When we finally rolled backward into the water, the sensation was different than I remembered. The ocean didn't embrace us so much as swallow us, pulling us down with an eagerness that felt almost hungry. The surface above became a distant promise of light that seemed to recede faster than physics should have allowed. At 40 feet, we began our underwater tour of the reef system I'd navigated thousands of times before. But familiar landmarks appeared subtly wrong in the artificial glow of our lights. Coral formations I could have drawn from memory seemed shifted, rotated, as if the entire landscape had been rearranged while we weren't looking. The colors that should have been vivid in our powerful beams appeared muted, washed out, as if the water itself was absorbing more light than it should. The first sign of wrongness came 20 minutes into the dive. Through my regulator, I could feel the subtle vibrations that indicated the boat's sonar was active above us. Odd, since we'd agreed on radio silence during the dive. The sound waves pulsed through the water in regular intervals, painting the darkness with invisible fingers of acoustic energy. That's when I noticed the particles in the water. At first, I attributed the swirling debris to natural sedimentation stirred up by our descent. But as I watched more carefully, the movement patterns defied explanation. Instead of settling or drifting with the current, the suspended matter moved in perfect spirals, as if something massive was circulating below us, just beyond the reach of our lights. I signaled the group to hold position and switched on my powerful primary light, the 3,000 lumen beam cutting through the black like a sword. The particles danced more frantically in the illumination, and I could see they weren't marine snow or stirred sediment at all. They were scales. Thousands upon thousands of silvery scales drifting upward in slow, hypnotic columns. The sonar pulses from above grew more insistent, and I could feel them in my chest cavity now, resonating through the water and into my bones. The rhythm had changed from regular sweeps to something more urgent, more focused. Whatever was down there, the boat's equipment had locked onto it. I checked my depth gauge, 65 feet. We were approaching the edge of recreational diving limits, but the reef's embrace pulled us deeper with each fin kick. The black below us seemed less like an absence of light, and more like a presence in itself, a living darkness that watched and waited. That's when I saw it move. The shadow passed beneath us so quickly I almost dismissed it as a trick of the light. But the displacement of water was unmistakable. Something enormous had just swept past our position, something that moved with purpose and intelligence. The bow wave of its passage rolled over us seconds later, a gentle but undeniable confirmation that we were no longer alone in the deep. I quickly signaled the others to form a star pattern, our emergency ascent formation where each diver maintains visual contact while preparing for rapid surface evacuation. But as we arranged ourselves, Tommy's light beam swept across something that made my blood turn to ice water. A mouth, just the edge of it, barely caught in the periphery of illumination before the creature moved away. But in that brief glimpse, I saw teeth the size of railroad spikes arranged in perfect rows, each one gleaming with a phosphorescent coating that made them glow like underwater beacons. What paralyzed me wasn't the obvious predatory capability of those jaws. It was what I saw embedded along what I could only assume was the creature's hide, a neat row of fishing hooks, dozens of them, protruding from flesh like some grotesque jewelry. They caught our lights and threw back brilliant reflections, creating a constellation of metallic stars against the black. The hooks weren't random debris or feeding scars. They were arranged too deliberately, too perfectly spaced, like a collar or necklace worn by something that understood ornamentation. The sonar pulses above us reached a fever pitch, and through the water I could hear the distant rumble of the boat's engines starting. That was wrong. Dead wrong. Jake had been designated as surface watch, and he would never start the engines while divers were down. The protocol was absolute. Engines off until all souls were aboard. But Jake was floating 3 feet to my left, his wide eyes reflecting my own growing panic in the beam of his flashlight. I gave the emergency ascent signal, and we began our rise to the surface. But as we climbed, I became aware of being followed. Not pursued. Followed. The presence below us kept pace, staying just outside the reach of our lights but close enough that we could feel its displacement through the water. It was studying us, I realized with growing dread, learning from us. At 30 feet, we paused for our safety stop, hanging in the blue-black void while our bodies processed the nitrogen we'd accumulated during the dive. Below us, the shadow continued its lazy circling, and I found myself hypnotized by the rhythm of its movement. The creature moved like something ancient, something that had been circling these waters for far longer than human memory could reach. During those 3 eternal minutes of decompression, Red's light beam caught something else, more hooks, but these were different, newer, shinier. Some still bore traces of fishing line, and one had a plastic lure attached that I recognized as a design that had only hit the market the previous month. The implications settled over me like a physical weight. This thing had been collecting hooks from fishing lines, from boats that passed overhead, from fishermen who thought their gear had simply snagged on the bottom or been taken by large fish. How long had it been accumulating these trophies? How many boats had unknowingly contributed to its growing collection? When we finally broke the surface, gasping and spitting out our regulators, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The absolute, unnatural silence of a night ocean without even the whisper of wind or the lap of waves against our boat. The surface was still mirror smooth, reflecting the stars in perfect detail, as if we were floating in space rather than water. The second thing I noticed was that Meridian's call was pointing southeast. We had anchored boo to the northwest, with the current and wind. I had checked and double-checked the heading before we descended, noted the position of Polaris off our starboard bow. It was a habit born from years of careful navigation, the kind of detail that kept divers from surfacing to find their boat gone. But now our vessel sat at the opposite heading, as if it had somehow spun a complete 180 degrees while we were below. The anchor line stretched taut beneath us, still holding position over the same drop-off. But the boat itself had pivoted like a weather vane in a storm that had never come. As we climbed aboard, dripping and shaking from more than just the night air, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Current could shift an anchored boat, though not in glass-calm conditions. The anchor could have dragged and reset, though our GPS showed we were in exactly the same coordinates. The creature could have been a whale or large shark, and the hooks could have been random debris that only appeared organized in the confused scatter of underwater lighting. But rationalization crumbled when I checked the boat's sonar log. The fish finder had recorded something ascending from depths that exceeded its maximum range, something that registered as a solid mass approximately 40 feet in length. The tracking showed it rising in perfect spiral patterns, maintaining a consistent distance from our position for exactly 27 minutes before descending again beyond the reach of our equipment. 27 minutes, the exact duration of our dive. Jake insisted he'd been monitoring our air bubbles on the surface the entire time, never leaving his watch position. Red swore the boat had never moved, despite his inability to explain the compass heading. Tommy claimed he'd felt something brush against his fins during ascent, but his nervous laughter suggested he hoped we'd dismiss it as imagination. I said nothing about the hooks, about the deliberate arrangement that suggested intelligence behind those ancient eyes. Some truths are too dangerous to share, too corrosive to sanity when spoken aloud. We pulled anchor and headed back to port in silence, each of us lost in private thoughts that we dared not voice. But as we cleared the reef and entered the shallower waters of the Sound, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. Not from below this time, but from behind, as if something was following our wake, maintaining just enough distance to avoid our engine noise and lights. I never turned around to check. Back at the marina, as we secured the boat and rinsed our gear, the normal rhythms of human activity felt surreal and distant. The dock lights created pools of harsh yellow illumination that hurt my eyes after the soft embrace of underwater darkness. The sounds of halyards clanging against masts and water lapping at hulls seemed artificially loud, almost aggressive. Red made some comment about the unusual calm and how it had made for perfect diving conditions. Tommy agreed, already planning our next night dive. Jake remained silent, coiling lines with mechanical precision. None of them mentioned the creature. None of them asked about the sonar readings or the boat's changed heading. It was as if the dive had occurred in some parallel dimension that couldn't quite intersect with ordinary reality. But I knew what I'd seen down there in the dark. Something old and patient. Something that had learned to decorate itself with the lost gear of surface dwellers. Something that understood the value of remaining just beyond the edge of human perception, collecting evidence of our presence while maintaining its own mystery. 3 weeks later, I read a brief item in the local fishing report about unusual equipment losses in the Key Largo area. Experienced captains were reporting lines cut clean through with surgical precision, lures vanishing without the telltale signs of fish strikes, even entire rods disappearing from holders, while boats drifted over deep water. The Coast Guard attributed the incidents to equipment failure and the strong currents that run through the area. The Marine Patrol suggested fishermen were simply losing gear to the reef system's sharp coral formations. Perfectly reasonable explanations that satisfied everyone except those of us who had seen the truth hanging in the darkness like a crown of stolen light. I still lead night dives in these waters. The tourists love the mystery and romance of exploring the reef after dark, and I need the income. But I've changed our protocols. We dive shallower now, staying well above the drop-off where the continental shelf disappears into abyssal depths. We use brighter lights and maintain closer formations. And I always check the boat's heading before we descend. Sometimes, on especially calm nights, when the water lies flat and black beneath the stars, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Nothing definite, nothing I could describe in a report or explain to a skeptical audience. Just the suggestion of something large and patient, circling beyond the reach of our lights, adding to its collection one careful piece at a time. The hooks are still down there, I know, gleaming in the darkness like offerings to something that remembers when these waters held different secrets, when the reef sang different songs to those brave or foolish enough to listen. And sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I wonder what it would be like to join that collection, to become another bright trophy in the creature's growing horde, another piece of evidence that humanity had passed this way and left its mark in the eternal dark. The thought should terrify me. Instead, it feels almost like an invitation. Story 8. The invitation came on cream-colored paper, the kind that whispers of old money and careful planning. 3 colleagues from the firm had signed their names in fountain pen ink: Holbrook, Thorne, and Westfield. Each signature a study in controlled precision. They wanted me to join them for what they called a reconnection retreat at a cabin in Vermont's Northeast Kingdom, a place where cell towers feared to tread, and the internet was nothing more than a distant urban myth. I should have recognized the trap in their sudden camaraderie. For months, I'd felt their eyes tracking my movements around the office, their conversations dying the moment I entered a room. But the promise of isolation, of stepping away from the suffocating maze of corporate politics, proved too tempting to resist. I packed my bags on a Thursday evening, telling myself that 3 days in the wilderness might wash away the growing paranoia that had been clinging to my thoughts like smoke. The drive north took us through increasingly desolate stretches of highway, where convenience stores grew scarce, and the trees pressed closer to the asphalt with each passing mile. Holbrook drove with the steady concentration of a man following directions written in his own hand, while Thorne and Westfield maintained a conversation about quarterly projections that felt rehearsed, artificial. Every so often, one of them would glance back at me through the rearview mirror, their eyes holding something I couldn't quite identify. The cabin materialized from the forest like a photograph developing in slow motion. It squatted among towering pines and sugar maples, its weathered cedar siding the color of dried blood in the late afternoon light. Windows stared out from beneath a sagging roofline, their glass reflecting nothing but darkness. A wraparound porch circled the structure like a wooden moat, its boards warped and split from decades of harsh winters. Inside, the air hung thick with the smell of wood smoke and something else, something organic and slightly sweet that reminded me of flowers left too long in stagnant water. The living room stretched before us, dominated by a stone fireplace large enough to roast a pig. Furniture clustered around it in careful arrangements, leather chairs that had seen better decades, a couch upholstered in fabric that might once have been burgundy, and tables bearing the scars of countless coffee cups and cigarette burns. What caught my attention immediately was the radio. It perched on the mantelpiece like a black metal vulture, its chrome dials catching firelight in sharp winks. The antenna extended upward at an aggressive angle, reaching toward the ceiling as if straining to escape. Holbrook noticed my gaze and explained that it was their only connection to the outside world, a shortwave radio capable of picking up broadcasts from across the globe, though reception depended heavily on atmospheric conditions and the mysterious whims of the ionosphere. That first night passed uneventfully. We ate dinner from cans heated over the fire, drank whiskey from glasses that someone had thoughtfully pre-positioned, and spoke about work with the careful neutrality of diplomats discussing trade agreements. I noticed that none of them seemed particularly interested in sleeping, preferring instead to nurse their drinks while shadows danced across the cabin walls. When I finally announced my intention to retire, their synchronized nods felt like a dismissal, I slept poorly, if at all. The cabin settled around me with the random groans and sighs that old buildings make in the darkness. But something about the sounds felt deliberate, orchestrated. Through the thin walls, I could hear the murmur of voices from the living room, though I couldn't make out individual words. The conversation continued until dawn, a steady undertone that wove itself into my restless dreams. The second day brought a change in the weather and a corresponding shift in my companion's behavior. Clouds gathered overhead like gathering cloth, blocking out the sun and casting the forest into premature twilight. Holbrook, Thorne, and Westfield moved around the cabin with newfound purpose, rearranging furniture and speaking in hushed tones that died whenever I approached. They claimed to be preparing for what they called the evening's activities, a phrase that made my skin crawl without any rational explanation. As darkness fell, they gathered me in the living room and explained their plan. It would be, according to Westfield, an exercise in trust and vulnerability. I would be blindfolded and seated in the center of the room while they read aloud from a collection of anonymous letters. Letters that they claimed contained honest assessments of my character written by people who knew me well. The point, Thorne explained with what might have been sincerity, was to help me understand how others perceived me, to break down the barriers that prevented authentic human connection. The logic felt flawed, even as they presented it, but something in their collective earnestness made refusal seem churlish. Perhaps it was the isolation working on my judgment, or maybe the whiskey had dulled my natural skepticism. Either way, I found myself agreeing to their proposal, even as every instinct screamed warnings I couldn't quite articulate. The blindfold was silk, expensive and opaque. It settled over my eyes like a second skin, instantly transforming the familiar cabin into a universe of sound and sensation. I heard the rustle of paper, the scrape of chair legs against wooden floors, and the subtle whisper of fabric as my companions settled into their positions around me. Holbrook began reading first, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a news anchor delivering particularly grim headlines. The letter he read painted me as ambitious to the point of ruthlessness, someone who would sacrifice friendships and principles for professional advancement. The specific details were uncannily accurate. References to office conversations I'd thought were private. Descriptions of strategies I'd never shared with anyone. Thorne followed with a letter that explored my supposed psychological instabilities, my tendency toward paranoid thinking and social isolation. The anonymous author seemed to know about my recent sleepless nights, my growing conviction that colleagues were plotting against me. How could a stranger have such intimate knowledge of my private struggles? Westfield's contribution was perhaps the most disturbing. The letter he read aloud described me as someone fundamentally disconnected from authentic emotion, someone who wore empathy like an ill-fitting costume while remaining essentially hollow inside. It spoke of specific instances when I'd failed to respond appropriately to others' pain, cataloging my emotional failures with surgical precision. But it was during Westfield's reading that the radio began to speak. At first, it was nothing more than static, the familiar white noise of electromagnetic interference that shortwave enthusiasts know well. But gradually, patterns emerged from the chaos. Voices, faint but unmistakably human, began threading their way through the static like smoke through a screen door. They spoke in fragments, single words and phrases that seemed to hang in the air long after the radio had moved on to other frequencies. My name came first, pronounced with crystal clarity despite the surrounding interference. Then coordinates, numbers that meant nothing to me but were delivered with the precision of a GPS announcement. Other names followed, people I recognized from work, from my neighborhood, from half-remembered encounters in coffee shops and grocery stores. The radio seemed to be conducting some sort of cosmic roll call, checking off names from a list I couldn't see. I asked about the radio, my voice sounding strange and muffled behind the blindfold. The reading stopped abruptly, and I could hear the shuffle of feet, the whisper of urgent consultation. Holbrook assured me that no one had touched the radio, that it sometimes picked up odd broadcasts late at night. Truckers, ham radio operators, even military communications bouncing off the atmosphere from thousands of miles away. But the explanation felt hollow, rehearsed, and the radio continued its strange litany, cycling through names and numbers with mechanical persistence. Some of the coordinates it announced were frighteningly specific, accompanied by what sounded like elevation readings and compass bearings. Was it possible that someone was using the radio to communicate? If so, who was listening? The letters continued, each one more invasive than the last. They described intimate details of my life that I'd never shared with anyone. Childhood fears, recurring dreams, the specific texture of loneliness that woke me at 3 in the morning. How could anonymous strangers know such things? Unless, of course, they weren't strangers at all. It was then that the radio began broadcasting my location. Not just the general area, Vermont's Northeast Kingdom, but precise coordinates that could only refer to this specific cabin. The voice emerging from the static spoke our exact position with military accuracy, followed by what sounded like tactical information. Number of occupants, available exits, visibility conditions, duration of current operation, current operation. The phrase echoed in my mind as I realized that whatever was happening here had been planned far in advance. The invitation, the isolated location, the absence of communication with the outside world. It all felt suddenly deliberate, designed. But designed for what purpose? I reached for the blindfold, my fingers trembling as they found the silk knot behind my head. Holbrook's voice rose in protest, claiming that removing the blindfold would invalidate the exercise. But I was beyond caring about their rules. The fabric fell away from my eyes like a shed skin, and I blinked in the sudden firelight. The scene that greeted me was wrong in ways I couldn't immediately process. The furniture had been moved while I sat blindfolded, rearranged into a configuration that made no logical sense. Chairs were stacked atop tables, creating towering sculptures that blocked the front windows. The couch had been dragged across the main entrance, its bulk forming an effective barricade. Even the smaller pieces, lamps, side tables, decorative objects, had been repositioned to create obstacles and dead ends throughout the room. Only one exit remained unobstructed, the back door that led to the wraparound porch and beyond that, to the forest. It stood open to the night air, revealing a rectangle of deeper darkness that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent rhythm. Cool air flowed through the opening, carrying scents of pine needles and damp earth. And in that darkness, 3 points of light waited with predatory patience. Flashlights, I realized, held by figures I couldn't quite make out. They stood motionless among the trees, their beams pointed downward to create pools of illumination that revealed nothing but forest floor. But something about their positioning suggested coordination, as if they were part of a larger plan that was only now reaching its crucial phase. Holbrook, Thorne, and Westfield watched me with expressions that had shed all pretense of friendship. Their faces held the calm satisfaction of fishermen who just felt the first tug on their line. The letters lay scattered at their feet, blank pages, I now noticed, completely devoid of writing. The radio continued its broadcast, but now I could hear the mechanical quality underlying the voice, the subtle repetition that suggested a recording rather than live communication. It was a loop, I realized, playing the same sequence of names and coordinates over and over again. But why? And who was supposed to be listening? Outside, the 3 lights began to move. Not toward the cabin, but in a slow, deliberate pattern that reminded me of a search grid. They were sweeping the forest floor methodically, looking for something, or someone. The possibility that they were waiting for me to run suddenly seemed less like paranoid fantasy and more like cold reality. But if that was their plan, then staying inside the cabin was equally dangerous. My former colleagues had created a maze of furniture that funneled movement toward a single exit, and that exit led directly into whatever trap was waiting in the woods. I was trapped between calculated human malice and the unknown threats lurking in the darkness beyond. The radio's voice grew louder, more insistent. It began broadcasting what sounded like countdown sequences, numerical progressions that seemed to be marking time until some predetermined event. The numbers descended with metronomic precision, and with each digit, the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop another degree. I found myself backing toward the blocked windows, my hands searching desperately for any gap in the furniture barricade. But Holbrook, Thorne, and Westfield had been thorough in their work. Every potential escape route had been carefully sealed, leaving only the path they wanted me to take. The path that led into the woods. The path that led toward those waiting lights. As I watched, a fourth light appeared in the forest, then a fifth. The pattern was expanding, growing more complex. Whatever was happening out there involved more people than just the three figures I'd initially spotted. How many others were waiting in the darkness? How long had they been planning this moment? The radio's countdown reached single digits, and the cabin lights began to flicker. Not the random flutter of unstable electrical current, but a deliberate pattern that matched the rhythm of the broadcast. Someone, or something, was controlling the power supply, manipulating the environment to create maximum psychological pressure. And then the lights went out entirely. In the sudden blackness, I could hear movement around me. Not just my three companions, but other sounds that suggested additional presences in the cabin. Footsteps that were too numerous to account for, breathing that came from too many directions at once. The darkness had become populated with watchers, and I was the focus of their collective attention. The radio continued its broadcast in the blackness, its voice now the only constant in a world that had lost all familiar reference points. But something about the transmission was changing. The mechanical quality was fading, replaced by something that sounded disturbingly organic, almost conversational. It began addressing me directly, not by name. That would have been too simple, too explicable. Instead, it spoke about my current situation with an intimacy that suggested direct observation. It described my elevated heart rate, my shallow breathing, the way my hands were shaking in the darkness. It knew things that no radio broadcast should know, details that could only come from someone who was watching me at that very moment. Outside, the lights had disappeared entirely. The forest had swallowed them without trace, leaving only an impenetrable wall of darkness beyond the open door. But somehow, that absence felt more threatening than their presence had been. At least when I could see the lights, I knew where the danger was located. Now, anything could be approaching through that blackness. The countdown reached 0, and silence descended over the cabin like a burial shroud. No radio, no movement, no sound of any kind except my own ragged breathing and the thunderous beating of my heart. Even the night sounds from outside, the insects and small animals that should have been providing a constant backdrop, had fallen silent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then I heard it. A single voice, coming from just outside the open door. Not through the radio this time, but carried on the night air itself. It spoke my name with casual familiarity, as if we were old friends meeting for coffee. The tone was warm, inviting, completely at odds with everything that had happened in the preceding hours. The voice belonged to someone I knew, someone I'd trusted, someone who, according to every rational measure of reality, shouldn't have been anywhere near Vermont. As footsteps approached the open door, slow, confident, unhurried, I realized that the real question wasn't whether what was happening to me was real or imagined. The real question was whether it mattered anymore. Reality had become negotiable, subject to revision by forces I couldn't understand or control. The footsteps reached the threshold, and a figure began to materialize from the darkness outside. But instead of relief or recognition, I felt only a deeper terror settling into my bones. Because if this person was here, in this place, at this moment, then everything I thought I knew about my life was about to be rewritten. And there would be no going back to the comfortable illusions I'd been living with. The figure stepped into the cabin, bringing with it the scent of earth and ending. Behind it, other shapes began to emerge from the forest. Not the 3 or 5 I'd counted earlier, but dozens of them, filling the darkness with a patience that felt eternal. I understood then that the retreat had never been about reconnection. It had been about collection, and I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Story 9. The dust hadn't settled from the Reno construction site when I stepped into the hotel lobby, my boots still caked with Nevada clay. The Riverside Inn squatted against the downtown skyline like a concrete tumor, its 70s architecture aging poorly under the desert sun. My company had booked me here for the week-long inspection, close to the site, they said, though I was beginning to question their definition of close. as the GPS had led me through increasingly desolate streets. The lobby smelled wrong. Not the typical mustiness of old carpet and industrial cleaner, but something sharper, metallic, like pennies left in stagnant water. The receptionist, a woman whose smile seemed painted on with the same precision as her burgundy lipstick, handed me a key card with fingers that lingered too long against mine. Her nails were chipped, I noticed. Small flakes of red polish scattered across the marble counter like dried blood. Room 847. 8th floor. The elevator groaned upward with mechanical reluctance, each floor number lighting up in that sickly amber that made everything look jaundiced. But when I reached my room, the card wouldn't work. The red light blinked mockingly at me 3 times, then nothing. I tried again. Same result. The hallway stretched in both directions, doors identical except for their brass numbers, all slightly tarnished, all slightly askew. By the time I made it back downstairs, my shirt was damp with sweat that had nothing to do with the Nevada heat. The woman at the desk had vanished, replaced by a younger man whose eyes never quite met mine when he mumbled something about system issues and try again later. The suggestion to grab a drink at the bar came with a gesture toward a dimly lit space adjacent to the lobby, where amber light spilled through a doorway like honey through a crack. The bar existed in permanent twilight. No windows, just dark wood paneling that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The air conditioning hummed with an irregular rhythm that made me think of labored breathing. I claimed a stool at the far end, away from the handful of other patrons scattered throughout the room like forgotten chess pieces. That's when I noticed them. The backpacks first, identical navy canvas bags with bright yellow reflective tape running across the top flap. 3 of them, maybe 4, positioned beside different tables with military precision. The tape caught what little light there was and threw it back in sharp, almost aggressive flashes. Construction workers, I told myself. Makes sense. We were all here for the same reason, weren't we? But construction workers don't typically wear their hard hats in hotel bars. The man approached before I could process this observation fully. White hard hat gleaming under the bar's amber lights. Work clothes too clean for someone who'd spent the day on a construction site. His smile stretched too wide, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, like a shark's mouth crammed into human proportions. From his back pocket, he produced 3 key cards. Not 1, not 2, but exactly 3. He laid them on the bar in a perfect line, each card identical to the others, each bearing the Riverside Inn logo. The plastic reflected the light from those damned backpack stripes, creating small lightning bolts of yellow across their surfaces. He slid one toward me without speaking, that smile never wavering. Up close, I could see that his hard hat wasn't just clean, it was pristine. Factory new. The kind of pristine that suggested it had never seen actual work, never been scuffed by real labor or marked by the honest wear of a construction site. Thanks, but I've got one, I said, patting my shirt pocket where my malfunctioning keycard rested. My voice sounded strangely hollow in the space, as if the dark wood was absorbing that too. His smile flickered, just for a moment, like a television changing channels. Behind him, the bartender, a thin man with premature gray streaks and nervous hands, suddenly became very interested in the television mounted in the corner. He grabbed the remote with movements too quick, too jerky, and clicked through channels with mechanical precision until he reached static. Pure white noise static. The sound filled the bar like radio interference, drowning out the air conditioning's irregular breathing. The man with the hard hat was still smiling, still holding the key card extended toward me. His eyes, I realized, were the wrong color. Not wrong in any way I could articulate, but wrong in the same way that the lobby had smelled wrong, the same way the elevator numbers had looked wrong. They were blue, but not any blue that belonged in a human face. Arctic blue, frozen lake blue, dead winter sky blue. I stood up too quickly, the bar stool scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on concrete. I should get back to my room. The static from the television seemed to pulse, growing louder, then softer, like breathing, like the building itself was breathing. The man finally lowered the keycard, but those 3 plastic rectangles remained on the bar's surface, perfectly aligned, perfectly reflective, perfectly wrong. Walking away felt like moving through water. Each step required conscious effort, as if the air itself had thickened around me. The other patrons in the bar didn't look up as I passed their tables, but I could feel their attention like heat lamps focused on my back. The backpacks seemed to have multiplied. Now I counted 5, 6, all with that same yellow tape that cut through the darkness like warning beacons. The elevator was waiting for me, doors already open, as if it had been anticipating my return. I stepped inside and pressed 8, but the button didn't light up. Neither did 7, 6, 5, or any of the others when I tried them in growing desperation. The only button that responded was B, basement. It glowed with that same sickly amber light, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. The elevator began to move without me pressing anything. Down. Always down. I tried to pry the doors open, but they remained sealed, smooth metal that gave no purchase to my fingers. The floor indicator showed my descent in numbers that seemed to drop too quickly. 3, 2, 1, G, and then B. But we didn't stop at B. The indicator went dark, and still we descended. The mechanical breathing of the air conditioning was louder here, or maybe it wasn't air conditioning at all. Maybe it was the building itself, inhaling and exhaling like some massive organism. The elevator walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with it, expanding and contracting by fractions of inches that my eyes insisted they were seeing, even as my mind rejected the possibility. When the doors finally opened, they revealed a corridor that shouldn't have existed. The basement stretched ahead of me in impossible dimensions, wider than the hotel's footprint could accommodate, longer than the city block on which the building sat. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead in patterns that almost suggested Morse code, casting intermittent shadows that moved independently of their sources. The air smelled of concrete dust and something else, something organic and warm and familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. The corridor was lined with doors, each bearing a number that made no mathematical sense. Room 7, room 1. The brass numbers were tarnished like those upstairs, but here they seemed to writhe in the inconsistent light, twisting into shapes that hurt to look at directly. I walked because there was nothing else to do. Behind me, the elevator doors had closed, and the call button beside them didn't respond to my pressing, no matter how frantically I jabbed at it. My footsteps echoed in ways that suggested the corridor was both vast and cramped simultaneously, the sound bouncing back from surfaces that weren't quite where they appeared to be. The first door I tried was locked. So was the second and the third. But room 1 opened at my touch, revealing a space that defied architectural logic. The room was exactly identical to the bar upstairs. Same dark wood paneling, same amber lighting, same wrong atmosphere. But instead of bottles behind the bar, there were backpacks. Dozens of them, all identical, all bearing that yellow reflective tape that now seemed to pulse with its own internal light. And sitting at the bar, his white hard hat gleaming like a beacon, was the same man who had offered me the key cards. He turned at my entrance, that too wide smile spreading across his face like spilled paint. In his hands, he held 3 key cards. Behind him, the bartender was adjusting a television that showed nothing but static. I backed out of the room, but the corridor had changed. What had been a straight passage was now a maze of intersecting hallways, each one lined with those impossible doors, each one stretching into distances that made my eyes water. The fluorescent lights overhead had synchronized their flickering into a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Or maybe my heartbeat had synchronized to match them. Room after room, I found the same scene. The bar, the backpacks, the man with the hard hat and his 3 key cards. Sometimes there were variations. The bartender's hair was a different color, or the television showed different static patterns. But the essential elements remained constant. Like a record skipping, repeating the same few seconds of music over and over until the repetition itself became a kind of torture. My phone had no signal down here. The time display showed numbers that couldn't be right. 2573, 1499, 642. The battery indicator fluctuated wildly, showing full charge, then empty, then charging symbols that weren't in any manufacturer's standard set. In what might have been the 15th iteration of the room, or the 50th, I finally spoke to the man with the hard hat. My voice came out as a whisper. barely audible over the television static that had become the soundtrack to this endless repetition. "What do you want?" His smile widened impossibly, revealing not teeth, but perfect white rectangles that caught the amber light and threw it back in precise geometric patterns. From his pocket, he produced 3 key cards and placed them on the bar with movements too fluid, too precise, like a machine programmed to mimic human gesture. "Room 847, he said, and his voice was the sound of concrete settling, of foundations shifting, of buildings growing tired and deciding to give up. "You wanted room 847. I picked up one of the key cards. It was warm to the touch, warm like living flesh, and the hotel logo seemed to move slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it. "This will get me to my room?" The static from the television grew louder, until it was all I could hear, all I could think. The man nodded, that terrible smile never wavering, and I understood that this was the choice I'd been brought here to make. Not between right and wrong, not between safe and dangerous, but between the nightmare I knew and the nightmare I didn't. I used the key card. The room it opened wasn't room 847. It wasn't any room that could exist in the physical world. It was my apartment back home, but wrong in every subtle way that mattered. The furniture was the same, but positioned with mathematical precision. The photographs on the walls showed my face, but the eyes in those pictures were Arctic blue, frozen lake blue, dead winter sky blue. And on the coffee table, arranged in a perfect line, were 3 key cards from the Riverside Inn. I'm writing this now sitting in my apartment that isn't quite my apartment, looking at those key cards that I know I'll eventually have to use. The television shows nothing but static, no matter what channel I turn to. Outside my window, Reno stretches into the distance, but the construction site is gone. In its place is another Riverside Inn, identical to the first, and another beyond that, stretching to the horizon like an infinite series of reflections. The air conditioning breathes with that same irregular rhythm. In my closet, I found a white hard hat that I don't remember buying. It's factory new, pristine, the kind that has never seen real work. Sometimes in the static on the television, I can see the bar. The man is still there, still smiling, still waiting with his 3 key cards. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I can see myself sitting across from him, accepting what he offers, starting the whole sequence again. The key cards on my coffee table are warm to the touch. I think they're waiting for me to use them. I think I want to use them. I think I already have. Story 10. The first time it happened, I assumed it was an accident. I was rushing through the glass corridors of Building 7, my badge swaying against my chest with each hurried step, when I felt the sudden pressure, a firm touch against the plastic card, followed by the distinct scratch of pen on laminate. The sound cut through the ambient hum of climate control and distant keyboards like fingernails on a chalkboard. When I looked down, a thin red line had appeared across the top of my badge, precisely where my throat would be if the card were flush against my neck. The mark was deliberate, surgical in its precision, drawn with the kind of red ink that reminded me of the pens teachers used to grade papers in elementary school. I spun around, but the corridor stretched empty behind me, filled only with the soft blue glow of the LED strips embedded in the ceiling. The polished concrete floor reflected nothing but my own bewildered face. My footsteps echoed back at me as I walked toward the elevator bank, the sound seeming to bounce off surfaces that shouldn't have been able to produce such sharp reverberations. That was Tuesday. Wednesday brought the van ride. The shuttle system at our campus was a marvel of efficiency. Gleaming white vehicles that glided silently between buildings on predetermined routes, their interiors designed with the same minimalist aesthetic that defined our workspace. I usually sat in the 3rd row, left side, where I could watch the landscaped grounds roll past through windows tinted just dark enough to make the outside world seem like a perpetual twilight. I was alone that afternoon, or so I thought. The van had that particular quality of emptiness that large spaces possess when they're designed for crowds, but occupied by only one person. The seats behind me, upholstered in that neutral gray fabric that corporate designers seem to love, stretched back in perfect rows toward the rear exit. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Not my own. Mine was shallow and quick, the result of rushing to catch the shuttle before it departed. This was different. Deep, measured inhalations that seemed to sync perfectly with my own respiratory rhythm. When I held my breath, the sound continued for exactly 2 seconds before stopping abruptly. When I resumed breathing, it began again, matching my pattern with unsettling precision. I turned to look over my shoulder. The seats were empty, each one pristine and undisturbed. The breathing continued, now seeming to come from directly behind my left ear, so close I could almost feel the warm exhalation against my skin. My scalp prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched, studied, catalogued. The van glided to a stop at Building 12, and I practically launched myself through the doors before they had fully opened. Thursday morning brought the conversation with the security guard. I'd seen him before. A tall man with graying temples and the kind of patient expression that suggested he'd spent years listening to employee complaints about everything from parking assignments to broken coffee machines. He approached me near the main entrance, his steps deliberate but unhurried. The guard suggested in the gentle but firm tone that security personnel seemed to master that I might want to vary my route for the next few days. Perhaps take the eastern pathway instead of my usual western route through the courtyard. Maybe use the stairs instead of the elevator. Just for a few days, he said, while they looked into some security concerns. When I asked what kind of concerns, his eyes shifted slightly to the left, not quite meeting my gaze. He mentioned something about reviewing camera footage, checking access logs, routine stuff. Nothing to worry about, he assured me, but it would be better if I mixed things up a bit. I wanted to ask about the red mark on my badge, about the breathing in the van, but something in his expression warned me against it. There was a careful neutrality there, the kind of professional mask that suggested he already knew more than he was saying. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in my apartment seemed amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the settling of the building's frame. I found myself checking the locks on my door 3 times before finally crawling into bed. And even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was taking notes about my behavior, documenting my routines with clinical precision. Friday morning, I discovered the room. I'd been following the security guard's advice, taking different routes through the building, when I got turned around near the testing labs on the 4th floor. The corridors in that section all looked identical. White walls, gray carpeting, numbered doors with small windows that revealed nothing but darkness beyond the glass. I was looking for a stairwell when I found the door that shouldn't have existed. Room 427B. The designation didn't match the numbering system used elsewhere in the building. I pressed my face to the small window, cupping my hands around my eyes to block out the hallway's fluorescent glare. Inside was my desk. Not a desk like mine, my actual desk, down to the specific arrangement of monitors, the coffee stain on the left corner that I'd never been able to completely clean, and the small succulent plant that my sister had given me 6 months ago. But it was wrong in ways that made my stomach clench with unease. The post-it notes scattered across the surface had been rewritten. I could see them clearly enough to recognize the familiar neon yellow squares, but the handwriting was different, neater than mine, more deliberate, as if someone had taken great care to improve upon my naturally hasty scrawl. The words appeared to be the same reminders and random thoughts I'd jotted down, but transformed into something that felt like a translation of my own mind into a foreign language. My chair was positioned at the exact angle I preferred, tilted back slightly and turned toward the right monitor. Even the small pile of receipts that I'd been meaning to file was there, though they were arranged in a neat stack instead of the haphazard collection I'd left behind. I tried the door handle. Locked. The corridor felt different when I stepped back from the window. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter, casting sharper shadows that created the illusion of movement in my peripheral vision. The climate control system had shifted to a different frequency, producing a low drone that seemed to vibrate through the floor and into my bones. I made it to the elevator without looking back, but I could feel the weight of observation following me, as if someone were taking careful notes about my pace, my posture, the way I kept glancing over my shoulder. Over the weekend, I couldn't stop thinking about the room. I found myself sketching the layout from memory, trying to recall every detail of how my desk had been recreated. The exercise felt compulsive, necessary, as if documenting what I'd seen might somehow make it less real or more explainable. But the drawings only raised more questions. How had someone gained access to my workspace? Who had taken the time to study my habits so closely that they could recreate not just the physical arrangement of objects, but the subtle patterns of my daily routine? Monday brought new discoveries. My actual desk, the one in my assigned workspace, had been subtly altered. The coffee stain was gone, cleaned with a precision that my own half-hearted attempts had never achieved. The post-it notes were in my handwriting, but I couldn't remember writing some of them. Small reminders about meetings I didn't recall scheduling, phone numbers I didn't recognize, fragments of thoughts that felt like echoes of my own mental processes, filtered through someone else's interpretation. The succulent was thriving. In fact, it looked healthier than it had in weeks, its leaves fuller and more vibrant. I couldn't remember the last time I'd watered it. Tuesday, the red marks returned. This time I was ready. I'd positioned myself near a mirrored surface in the lobby, using the reflection to monitor my back while I appeared to read emails on my phone. When I felt the familiar pressure against my badge, I spun around immediately. Nothing, but in the mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow that seemed to separate itself from the darker alcove near the reception desk, moving with a fluidity that suggested purpose rather than coincidence. I approached the alcove slowly, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. The space was empty, but the air felt disturbed, as if someone had recently passed through. There was a faint scent, too, something clinical and sharp, like the smell of a doctor's office or a laboratory. When I checked my badge, the red line was there again. This time, it had been joined by a second mark, parallel to the first, creating the impression of a precise measurement or marking system. Wednesday's van ride was different. I deliberately chose a seat in the back row, positioning myself where I could observe the entire interior. The vehicle filled with the usual collection of employees, engineers, designers, project managers, all absorbed in their phones or tablets, all maintaining the polite distance that characterized most workplace interactions. As the van began to move, I noticed him. A man in a gray suit seated 3 rows ahead who seemed to be breathing in perfect synchronization with my own rhythm. When I held my breath, he stopped. When I resumed, he matched my pattern exactly. His shoulders rose and fell with mechanical precision, never varying from the cadence I set. I changed my breathing pattern deliberately, shorter inhalations, longer exhalations, irregular pauses. He adjusted immediately, his movements tracking mine with the accuracy of a metronome following a conductor. When the van stopped at Building 12, he didn't get off. Neither did I. We continued the circuit, his breathing maintaining its eerie synchronization with mine, while other passengers came and went around us. I never saw his face clearly, just the back of his head, the gray fabric of his jacket, the unnaturally steady movement of his shoulders. At Building 7, I finally stood to leave. As I walked toward the exit, I caught a glimpse of his reflection in the van's darkened window. The face that looked back at me was familiar in a way that made my hands shake as I stepped onto the pavement. It looked like mine. Thursday brought the conversation I'd been dreading. The security guard found me again, this time near the coffee station on the 3rd floor. His expression was more serious now, concerned in a way that suggested the routine nature of our previous conversation had evolved into something more pressing. He mentioned reviewing the footage from the cameras positioned throughout the building. There were some discrepancies, he said, some unusual patterns that the system had flagged for review. Nothing alarming, he was quick to add, but enough to warrant a more thorough investigation. When I asked what kind of patterns, he paused for a long moment, studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Sometimes, he said carefully, the cameras captured me in 2 different locations at the same time. The timestamps were identical, but the footage showed me in my office while simultaneously walking through the lobby or sitting in the cafeteria while also standing at the elevator bank. Technical glitch, he suggested, but his tone carried the weight of someone who wasn't entirely convinced by his own explanation. I wanted to tell him about the room, about the breathing, about the red marks that appeared on my badge with increasing frequency. But the words felt dangerous, as if speaking them aloud might transform something that existed in the uncertain space between real and imagined into something that demanded more definitive action. Friday, I decided to investigate. I returned to the fourth floor, to the corridor where I'd found room 427B. This time, I came prepared with a small flashlight and a smartphone camera, determined to document whatever I might find. The door was exactly where I remembered it, but the number had changed. 427C now, as if the room had shifted slightly along some dimensional axis that allowed for subtle alterations in its fundamental identity. Through the window, my desk was still there, but the arrangement had evolved. The post-it notes had multiplied, covering more of the surface in neat, orderly rows. The handwriting was becoming more like mine, not quite identical but closer, as if someone were practicing, refining their imitation through careful repetition. A new addition caught my attention. A notebook lay open beside the keyboard, its pages covered with what appeared to be observations about my behavior. I could make out fragments through the glass, timing notes, descriptions of my routines, sketches of my facial expressions in various situations. The handwriting was the same careful script I'd seen on the rewritten post-it notes. As I watched, a pen moved across the page. Not held by a hand, just a pen, writing by itself, recording observations in real time. The words appeared in measured strokes. Subject observing from hallway. Posture tense. Breathing elevated. Duration of observation. 43 seconds and continuing. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. The pen continued writing, though I could no longer see the specific words being recorded. The weekend passed in a haze of sleepless hours and growing certainty that I was either losing my mind or caught in something far worse than simple paranoia. By Monday, the red marks on my badge had formed a complete outline around my neck. I showed up for work that morning with the grim determination of someone who had exhausted all rational explanations and was ready to confront whatever impossible truth awaited. The familiar routines of the office felt like performance art, going through the motions of normalcy, while something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface of ordinary reality. My desk looked exactly as I'd left it, except for one small detail. The notebook from room 427B was there, positioned where my usual notepad belonged. I opened it with trembling fingers. Pages and pages of observations, written in handwriting that was now indistinguishable from my own. Notes about my habits, my preferences, my responses to various stimuli. Detailed analyses of my speech patterns, my gait, my unconscious gestures, and on the final written page, a single sentence that made my vision blur with vertigo. Integration process, 94% complete. Final adjustments pending. I closed the notebook and looked around the office. Everyone seemed normal, typing, talking on phones, attending meetings. But now I noticed the subtle wrongness that had been building for weeks. Conversations that stopped too abruptly when I passed. Glances that lingered a fraction too long. Smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. The van ride home that evening was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I sat in my usual seat, hyper-aware of every breath, every heartbeat, every involuntary movement. Behind me, I could hear the soft scratch of a pen moving across paper, recording, documenting, preparing. When I got home, I found the mail waiting in my usual spot on the kitchen counter. Bills, advertisements, and a single envelope with my name written in familiar handwriting. Inside was a photograph of myself, taken from behind while I sat at my desk. On the back, someone had written a single word in red ink. Ready. I'm writing this now because I need to document what's happening before it's complete, before I can no longer distinguish between what I remember being and what I'm becoming. The red marks are gone from my badge, not cleaned away, but somehow absorbed, as if they were never meant to be permanent decorations but rather guidelines for a process I'm only beginning to understand. Tomorrow I'll go to work as usual. I'll take the van, sit at my desk, attend my meetings. I'll smile and nod, and contribute to conversations with the same voice, the same words, the same mannerisms that my colleagues have always known. But tonight, As I write these words, I can hear breathing that isn't mine coming from somewhere inside my apartment. Measured, deliberate inhalations that seem to be teaching my lungs a new rhythm, preparing them for a different kind of existence. The integration process is nearly complete, and I'm no longer certain which one of us will wake up tomorrow morning. Story 11. The Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from the live oaks lining Abercorn Street, filtering the afternoon light into sickly yellow patches that danced across the cracked sidewalk. I'd been living in Savannah for 3 months, renting the second floor of a Victorian row house that creaked with every breath of wind. The locals called it character. I called it unsettling. The house on the corner had earned itself a reputation among the neighbors, something about how it seemed to watch you walk by. Mrs. Whitmore from next door mentioned it the day I moved in, her voice dropping to a whisper as she nodded toward the imposing 3-story structure with its ornate ironwork and weathered brick facade. The windows reflected the afternoon sun like lidless eyes, and I understood what she meant. There was something deliberate about the way shadows gathered in its recesses, something that made your skin crawl if you stared too long. I hadn't planned on photographing it. The listing for my Honda needed pictures, and I'd parked out front purely by chance. The corner provided good lighting, and I needed to sell the car before my next rent payment. As I crouched down to capture the vehicle's profile, the camera's viewfinder swept across the house's second-floor windows. That's when I saw him. The face appeared so briefly I almost convinced myself it was a trick of light and shadow. But the camera doesn't lie. And when I reviewed the digital display, there he was, a man standing behind the lace curtains of the middle window. The resemblance struck me like a physical blow. Same jawline, same nose, same deep-set eyes. The only difference was the stubble covering his chin and cheeks, a 5 o'clock shadow I'd meticulously shaved off that very morning. My hand trembled as I lowered the camera. The window now showed only the pale curtains, motionless in the still air. I waited for movement, for any sign that someone lived in what appeared to be an abandoned house. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and yellowed newspapers accumulated on the front porch like fallen leaves. No car sat in the driveway. No lights glowed behind any of the windows as evening approached. I took more pictures of the car, but my eyes kept drifting back to that second-floor window. By the time I finished, dusk had settled over the neighborhood like a heavy quilt, and the streetlights began their nightly vigil. The corner house seemed to absorb the darkness rather than be consumed by it, its bulk more felt than seen. Back in my apartment, I uploaded the photos to my laptop. The image quality was sharp, each detail rendered with digital precision. I zoomed in on the window until the pixels began to separate, studying the face that shouldn't have been there. The features were undeniably familiar. Not just similar, but identical. Same scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood accident. Same slight asymmetry to the ears. Even the way the hair fell across the forehead matched perfectly. The only explanation that made sense was a trick of reflection. Perhaps my own image somehow bounced back from the glass. But the angle was wrong, and the stubble remained inexplicable. I'd shaved carefully that morning, checking twice in the bathroom mirror. My reflection now showed the same smooth jawline I'd seen in the morning. Sleep came fitfully that night. Every creak of the old house sent my heart racing, and twice I caught myself checking the locks on my apartment door. The sound of settling timbers took on ominous significance, and the wind through the moss-draped oaks outside my window whispered secrets I didn't want to understand. It was past midnight when I heard the first sound, a slow, deliberate scraping, like fingernails drawn across glass. The noise seemed to come from outside, from the direction of the corner house. I pressed my face to my bedroom window, but the angle only allowed a partial view of the neighboring structure. The street lay empty under the amber glow of the streetlights, and shadows pooled in doorways like spilled ink. The scraping came again, more pronounced this time, followed by what sounded like a window sash being raised. My skin crawled with the certainty that something was wrong, that the normal nighttime sounds of the neighborhood had been replaced by something deliberate and watchful. I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs, my bare feet silent on the worn wooden steps. The front door's deadbolt turned with a soft click, and I stepped onto the porch. The night air was thick with humidity and the cloying scent of jasmine. Crickets chirped in the distance, but the immediate area around the corner house seemed strangely quiet, as if even the insects sensed something amiss. The flashlight beam swept across the house's facade, illuminating peeling paint and rust stains that looked like tears in the artificial light. The second-floor window, the same one where I'd seen the face, stood open. The lace curtains billowed gently in a breeze I couldn't feel, and the darkness beyond seemed deeper than it should have been. I walked closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. The front yard was muddy from an earlier rain shower, the soft earth holding moisture like a sponge. I shined the light down, looking for footprints, for any sign that someone had been moving around the property. The ground showed only the undisturbed impressions of raindrops and the meandering trails left by insects. But when I looked up at the open window, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Handprints. 5 distinct finger marks pressed against the inside surface of the glass, as if someone had placed their palms flat against the window and pushed. The prints were fresh, clearly defined in the condensation that had gathered on the inner surface. No one could have made those marks from outside. I stood there for what felt like hours, the flashlight beam wavering as my hands shook. The logical part of my mind searched for explanations. Maybe someone was squatting in the house. Maybe the marks were old and only now visible due to the humidity. But the prints were too clear, too recent, and they matched the size and shape of my own hands perfectly. The curtains moved again, a subtle shift that could have been caused by air circulation inside the house, or by someone stepping away from the window. I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, asking if anyone was there. The only response was the distant sound of a car passing several blocks away. I retreated to my apartment, but sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to move independently, and the familiar sounds of the old building took on sinister overtones. I found myself checking and rechecking the locks, peering through the peephole until my eye ached from the strain. The next morning brought no relief. Exhaustion weighed on my shoulders like a lead blanket, and the mirror in my bathroom reflected hollow eyes and pale skin. I shaved carefully, as had become my ritual, but couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The reflection seemed to linger a moment too long after I moved away, and twice I spun around, expecting to find someone standing behind me. The corner house looked different in daylight, less ominous, but somehow more wrong. The open window from the previous night was now closed, the lace curtains hanging motionless behind clear glass. No trace remained of the handprints I'd seen, as if they'd been carefully wiped away or had never existed at all. I made coffee with hands that trembled slightly and tried to focus on normal activities. The car photos needed to be posted online, and I had work calls to return, but concentration proved impossible. My eyes kept drifting to the corner house, and I found myself studying every window for signs of movement. By afternoon, the compulsion to investigate had become overwhelming. I walked to the city records office and requested information about the property. The clerk, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, seemed puzzled by my questions, but was helpful enough. The house had been empty for over a year, he explained, ever since the previous owner had moved to a nursing facility. No one else had access to the property. I asked about the owner's appearance, describing what I'd seen in the window. The clerk's expression grew strange, and he studied me with obvious confusion. The resemblance was remarkable, he admitted. Almost like looking at the previous owner 40 years ago. The man had lived alone in the house for decades, rarely venturing outside except for necessities. The temperature in the records office seemed to drop 10 degrees. I thanked the clerk and left quickly, my footsteps echoing in the marble hallway like gunshots. The afternoon sun felt weak and distant as I walked back toward home, and shadows seemed to follow me regardless of my direction. That evening, I positioned myself at my window with a clear view of the corner house. The sun set behind a bank of clouds, painting the sky in shades of rust and gold that reminded me of dried blood. As darkness gathered, I watched the house settle into its nighttime vigil. No lights appeared in any of the windows. No movement disturbed the stillness. But at 11:47 p.m., I heard the scraping again. This time I was ready. The flashlight was charged, and I'd left my apartment door unlocked for quick access. I crept down the stairs and out onto the porch, my bare feet silent on the wooden boards. The night was cooler than the previous evening, and goosebumps rose along my arms as I approached the corner house. The second-floor window stood open again, the curtains moving in a breeze that touched nothing else. I aimed the flashlight beam at the glass and my heart nearly stopped. New handprints covered the inside surface. Not just one set, but dozens. They overlapped and intersected like a desperate message written in condensation and finger oils. Some were clear and distinct, while others appeared smeared, as if the person making them had been moving frantically. But it was the final detail that sent me stumbling backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. Among the chaotic pattern of handprints, words had been traced in the condensation. The letters were barely visible, written in what appeared to be fingertip impressions on the glass. "Get out, get out, get out." I ran back to my apartment, slamming the door behind me and throwing every deadbolt and chain lock. My breathing came in short, painful gasps, and sweat poured down my face despite the cool night air. I pressed my back against the door and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The words could have been written by anyone, but the handprints were another matter entirely. They matched my hands perfectly, not just in size, but in the distinctive patterns of lines and whorls. I pressed my palms against my apartment window and compared the prints. The match was exact, down to the small scar on my right palm from a childhood accident. Hours passed before I worked up the courage to look outside again. Dawn was breaking over the neighborhood, painting the sky in pale yellow and pink. The corner house sat quietly in the growing light, its windows reflecting the sunrise like blank eyes. The second-floor window was closed once again, and no trace remained of the handprints or the desperate message. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching the property's history. Online records revealed a pattern stretching back over a century. Single men, living alone, staying for decades before disappearing or dying under mysterious circumstances. The descriptions of the previous residents were eerily similar. Same height, same build, same facial features described in obituaries and police reports. The most recent owner had lived in the house for 37 years before being found wandering the streets in a state of confusion, claiming that someone else was living in his home. He'd been placed in a psychiatric facility and died there 6 months later, still insisting that his house had been stolen by an imposter. As the sun set on my second sleepless night, I made a decision. I would enter the house and confront whatever was happening. The not knowing was worse than any truth I might discover. I gathered a flashlight, a crowbar from my toolbox, and what remained of my courage. The front door of the corner house was locked, but the crowbar made quick work of the ancient deadbolt. The door swung open with a prolonged groan, revealing a hallway that stretched back into impenetrable darkness. The air inside was stale and thick, carrying the scent of dust and something else, something organic and unpleasant. My flashlight beam revealed a staircase leading to the second floor, its banister worn smooth by decades of hands. Family photographs lined the walls, their glass darkened by age and grime. As I climbed the steps, each one creaking under my weight, I noticed that the faces in the photographs all looked familiar. Different time periods, different clothing styles, but the same features repeated in frame after frame. The second-floor hallway was narrow and oppressive, with doorways leading to rooms that gaped like open mouths in the darkness. I found the middle room, the one with the window where I'd seen the face. The door stood slightly ajar, and a thin line of pale light seeped through the crack. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was furnished as a bedroom, but everything was covered in a thick layer of dust except for one area near the window. Someone had been living here, sleeping in the bed using the dresser. Personal items were scattered across the surface. A razor, shaving cream, aftershave, the same brands I used. But it was the mirror above the dresser that made my knees buckle. My reflection stared back at me, but it was wrong. The face in the mirror wore a heavy beard, wild and unkempt. The eyes were sunken and haunted, surrounded by dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights and growing madness. The clothes were mine, but torn and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. I reached up to touch my clean-shaven face, and the reflection mimicked the movement. But in the mirror, dirty fingernails scratched at a beard that wasn't there. I opened my mouth to speak, and the reflection opened its mouth as well, revealing teeth that were yellowed and cracked. Behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps that matched my own gait perfectly. I spun around, but the doorway stood empty. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was gone. The glass showed only the room behind me, empty and waiting. The footsteps grew closer. I grabbed the flashlight and ran from the room, down the hallway toward the stairs. Behind me, I heard my own voice calling out, asking who was there, demanding that I stop. The words echoed strangely in the narrow space, as if spoken through layers of glass and time. I reached the bottom of the stairs and ran for the front door, my heart pounding so hard I could taste copper in my mouth. The exit seemed impossibly far away, the hallway stretching longer with each step. Behind me, the footsteps gained ground, accompanied now by heavy breathing that sounded exactly like my own. I burst through the front door and into the cool night air, gasping and stumbling across the muddy yard. When I looked back, a figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall, thin, wearing clothes identical to mine. In the darkness, I couldn't make out the face, but I knew with absolute certainty that it would match my own. The figure raised one hand in what could have been a wave or a warning. Then it stepped back into the house, and the door swung shut with a sound like a sigh. I moved out of the neighborhood the next morning, packing my belongings with shaking hands and avoiding any glance toward the corner house. The landlord seemed relieved to see me go, mentioning that previous tenants in my apartment had often complained about feeling watched. But now, 3 states away, I've started noticing things. Neighbors who mention houses that look back, mirrors that don't quite reflect what they should. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of windows scraping open in houses where no one else lives. I've grown a beard since leaving Savannah, and I shave it off every morning with obsessive care. But each time I look in the mirror, it seems to take longer for my reflection to catch up with my movements. And sometimes, just for a moment, I see the wild, haunted eyes of someone who's been living in that corner house far longer than any human being should. The car photos are still on my phone, and sometimes I study that image of the face in the window. The resemblance is perfect, but I've started to notice other details. The way the shadows fall across the features, the angle of light through the glass, the expression in those familiar eyes that seems to be saying something I'm not ready to understand. I tell myself it was stress, isolation, the power of suggestion in an old city full of ghost stories and local legends. But every morning when I shave, I wonder if somewhere in Savannah, in a house that watches the street with patient eyes, someone else is standing in front of a mirror and seeing my face looking back at them. And I wonder how long it will be before I find myself standing in a window, watching someone else take pictures of their car, waiting for them to notice the face behind the curtains that looks exactly like their own. Story 12. The red sandstone walls of Zion pressed in around me like the ribcage of some ancient, slumbering beast. I'd been hiking alone for 3 hours, my boots finding purchase on the narrow trail that wound deeper into the canyon's throat. The October sun hung merciless overhead, turning the rock into a furnace that radiated heat in waves I could taste on my tongue. Metallic and dry, like blood and dust. I should have turned back when the other hikers disappeared from view an hour ago. Should have listened to the park ranger's warning about taking the unmarked spur trail that branched off from the main route. But something had pulled me forward, a compulsion I couldn't name, as if the canyon itself was calling. The silence here was absolute. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but something heavier, more deliberate. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, swallowed by the towering walls that stretched up into narrow ribbons of blue sky. The air felt thick, pregnant with an expectancy that made my skin crawl. That's when it happened. The sensation that made me stop dead in my tracks. It started as a prickling along my spine, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the empty trail behind me, the shadowed alcoves carved into the canyon walls. The twisted juniper trees clinging to impossible ledges. Nothing. Yet the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing second. But it wasn't the sensation of eyes upon me that froze my blood. It was the wrongness of the direction. The feeling wasn't coming from behind or above, where a predator might perch or a fellow hiker might observe. It was coming from below, from within the earth itself. I found myself staring at the trail ahead, where it curved sharply to the right around a massive pillar of stone. The path here narrowed to perhaps 3 feet wide, with a sheer drop to my left and the canyon wall rising impossibly high to my right. Something about that curve made my stomach lurch, a primal warning that urged me to flee. Instead, I reached down and picked up a small stone, no larger than a marble. Without fully understanding why, I threw it ahead, watching it arc through the air and disappear around the bend. The sound that came back made every muscle in my body tense. It wasn't the simple clatter of stone on stone I'd expected. Instead, there was a dry, rhythmic shaking, like a maraca filled with sand, or perhaps the warning of a rattlesnake. But underneath that familiar sound was something else, something that defied explanation, a scraping, as if something heavy was being dragged across rough stone. I stood frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs as the sounds continued for several long seconds before fading into the oppressive silence. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, but curiosity, that fatal human flaw, compelled me forward. I edged toward the curve, each step deliberate and careful. As I rounded the bend, the trail opened into a small alcove carved naturally into the canyon wall. The space was perhaps 20 feet deep and half as wide, with walls that curved upward into shadow. And there, pressed into the red sandstone, were marks that made my breath catch in my throat. They looked like drag marks, but wrong in every conceivable way. Instead of running downward as logic would dictate, they climbed the wall in serpentine patterns, disappearing into cracks too narrow for anything substantial to pass through. The marks were fresh, so fresh that tiny fragments of sandstone still clung to the grooves, catching the filtered sunlight like glitter. I approached the wall with trembling hands, running my fingers along the strange furrows. The stone felt warm beneath my touch, warmer than the ambient temperature would explain. And as I traced the marks upward, following their impossible path, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The furrows weren't carved into the stone. They were carved from within it, as if something had pushed outward from inside the solid rock. A sound behind me made me spin around, my heart racing. But the alcove was empty, the trail beyond silent and still. Yet I could have sworn I'd heard breathing, slow, deliberate, and far too large to belong to any creature I knew. The return hike to the visitor center passed in a blur of paranoid glances over my shoulder and frequent stops to listen for sounds that never came. By the time I reached the ranger station, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western rim of the canyon, painting the red walls in shades of amber and rust. The ranger behind the desk was a weathered man in his 50s, his face carved by decades of desert sun and wind. When I described what I'd found, his expression grew thoughtful, then troubled. "You took the spur trail past Weeping Rock?" he asked, his voice carrying a note I couldn't identify. I nodded, describing the narrow path that had led me to the strange alcove. The ranger was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on something beyond the window. When he finally spoke, his words sent a chill through me, despite the lingering heat of the day. "We find snakes up there sometimes," he said slowly. "In crevices 50, 60 feet up the canyon walls. Places where no snake should be able to climb. Places where there's no food, no water, no reason for them to go." He paused, his weathered hands folding on the desk. "It's like they climbed up from inside the rock itself." I tried to laugh, to dismiss his words as folklore or exaggeration, but the sound died in my throat. The marks I'd seen, the wrongness of their direction, the heat radiating from stone that should have been cool in shadow. It all suddenly felt connected to something larger, something I didn't want to understand. "You're not the first hiker to mention strange sounds from that area," the ranger continued. "Of course, it could be wind through the rock formations. Sound carries funny in these canyons, plays tricks on the mind." but his tone suggested he didn't believe his own explanation any more than I did. That night, in my hotel room in Springdale, I found myself unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those upward climbing marks, felt that unnatural heat beneath my fingertips. I researched the geology of Zion, learning about the Navajo sandstone that formed the canyon walls, about the millions of years of wind and water that had carved the labyrinthine passages. Nowhere did I find any explanation for what I'd witnessed. The next morning, despite every rational thought screaming against it, I returned to the trail. The hike to the alcove seemed shorter this time, the path more familiar. But as I approached the curve where I'd thrown the stone the day before, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were new marks in the dirt of the trail, not footprints. I was certain I was the only person who'd been here recently. These were different, stranger. Shallow furrows in the packed earth, as if something had scraped along the ground. And like the marks on the canyon wall, they led in an impossible direction. They led downward, disappearing into solid stone. I followed the marks to where they vanished into what appeared to be a seamless section of the trail. The sandstone here showed no cracks, no fissures large enough for even a pencil to pass through. Yet the furrows ended abruptly at this spot, as if whatever had made them had simply melted into the rock. Kneeling, I pressed my ear to the stone, feeling foolish but unable to resist. At first, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing, my own pulse. But then, so faint I might have imagined it, I heard something else. Movement. Deep below, something was moving through spaces that shouldn't exist. I jerked back, my hand instinctively reaching for the small camping knife on my belt. The motion was automatic, defensive, though what protection a 4-inch blade could offer against something that moved through solid rock was anyone's guess. The afternoon sun had shifted, and the alcove around the bend now lay mostly in shadow. But as I approached it again, I noticed the temperature difference immediately. The space was noticeably warmer than the surrounding area, as if heated from within. The drag marks on the wall seemed more pronounced now, deeper, and there were new ones, fresh gouges that hadn't been there the day before. But it was the sound that finally broke my resolve. It started as a low vibration I felt more than heard, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sandstone walls seemed to hum with it, a frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur slightly at the edges. And underneath that harmonic drone was the scraping again, closer now, more distinct. Something was moving through the rock, something large enough to displace stone, to create passages where none should exist. Something that was aware of my presence. I backed away from the alcove, my eyes never leaving the strange marks that now seemed to writhe in the shifting shadows. The scraping sound grew louder, more urgent, as if whatever was making it was trying to reach the surface, trying to reach me. The run back to the main trail was a nightmare of echoing footsteps and imagined pursuit. Every loose stone that clattered behind me sounded like something emerging from the depths. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. By the time I reached the visitor center parking lot, I was drenched in sweat despite the cooling evening air. The ranger from the day before was just leaving his shift as I stumbled into the building. He took one look at my face and guided me to a chair, pressing a cup of water into my shaking hands. "You went back, didn't you?" he said quietly. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. "I've been working these canyons for 23 years, he continued, his voice so low I had to strain to hear him. "I've seen things that don't fit in any guidebook, heard sounds that don't match any animal we're supposed to have here. But that trail," he shook his head, "that trail is different. It's like the rock there is hollow, like something's made a home in spaces that aren't supposed to exist." He walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder thick with papers. "These are incident reports from that area going back 15 years. Hikers reporting strange sounds, unusual heat signatures, marks in the stone that appear overnight. We've had geologists out there, acoustic specialists, even brought in some equipment from the university. Nothing conclusive, nothing that explains what people experience." I flipped through the reports with growing unease. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. The upward climbing marks, the heat from stone, the sounds of movement from below. But what chilled me most were the photographs. They showed the same alcove I'd visited, but from different time periods spanning more than a decade. In each photo, the marks on the wall were different, in new locations, following new patterns, but always climbing upward, always defying gravity and logic. The interesting thing, the ranger said, watching me study the images, is that we've never found any evidence of conventional wildlife in that area. No scat, no shed skin, no remains of prey animals. It's like nothing natural wants to go there, or can survive there. I thought about the silence of the place, the absence of even insects or birds, the wrongness I'd felt from the moment I'd set foot on that spur trail. "What do you think is making these marks?" I asked. The ranger was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on the darkening canyon beyond the window. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of years spent confronting the inexplicable. "I think there are places in this world where the rules don't apply the way they should. Places where the boundary between what's solid and what's not, between what's possible and what's impossible, gets thin. Maybe what you found isn't an animal at all. Maybe it's something else entirely, something that doesn't need our kind of space to exist." That night, lying in bed as the desert wind howled through the canyon beyond my window, I tried to rationalize what I'd experienced. Heat mirages, acoustic illusions, the power of suggestion working on an isolated mind, all perfectly reasonable explanations for phenomena that had reasonable explanations. But sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of movement beneath stone, of things that swam through solid matter as easily as fish through water, dreams of vast spaces carved not by wind and water, but by something that built its world by consuming the substance of ours. And in those dreams, I heard the scraping growing closer, more insistent, as if my presence at the alcove had awakened something that had been dormant for far too long. I left Zion the next morning, cutting my vacation short with excuses about work emergencies and family obligations. But even now, months later and hundreds of miles away, I find myself drawn to geology texts and cave systems, searching for explanations that remain stubbornly elusive. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I press my ear to the wall of my basement and listen. The silence here is different from the silence of the canyon. Normal, reassuring, empty of secrets. But occasionally, just occasionally, I think I hear something moving beneath the foundation. Something that scrapes softly against stone and concrete, working its way slowly upward through spaces that shouldn't exist. And I wonder if some things, once awakened, refuse to stay buried in the depths where they belong. Story 13. The fluorescent bulb in our shared dormitory hummed with that particular frequency that made my teeth ache, a sound I'd grown accustomed to during my third year at the Criminology Institute in Montreal. The November wind rattled our windows with skeletal fingers, and somewhere in the walls, the old building's heating system groaned like something trapped and dying. I was reviewing case files when he knocked. 3 measured taps, perfectly spaced, always 3. My roommate stood in the doorway, that familiar half-smile playing at the corners of his mouth. In his hands, he held a manila folder thick enough to contain someone's entire life. The overhead light cast strange shadows across his angular face, making his eyes appear deeper set than usual. "I have a proposition," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk without invitation. "A practical exercise, something that'll give us both an edge in behavioral analysis next semester." He slid the folder across the desk's scratched surface. The manila was worn at the edges, as if it had been handled countless times. There was no label, no identification mark of any kind. "What kind of exercise?" I asked, though something in my chest had already begun to tighten. "Routine surveillance. The professor mentioned how understanding patterns of behavior is crucial for criminal investigation. I thought we could practice, pick random subjects, follow them for 72 hours, document their habits, their routines, their vulnerabilities." The word hung in the air like smoke from a dying cigarette. I stared at the folder, noticing how his fingers drummed against the desk in a rhythm that seemed almost familiar. "You want us to stalk people?" "Study them," he corrected, his voice carrying that same measured cadence he used during our late-night conversations about criminal psychology. Understand what makes them predictable, what makes them exposed. He gestured toward the folder with one pale finger. I've already started. Consider this a demonstration. The manila felt heavier than it should have when I picked it up. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Black and white prints with timestamps in the corners. A figure walking across campus. The same figure entering the library. Sitting in the cafeteria. Standing at a bus stop. It took me a moment to recognize myself. My breath caught somewhere between my throat and my lungs. The photographs were recent. Some from yesterday, others from the past week. In each one, I was captured in perfect clarity while everything around me remained slightly blurred, as if the camera had been focused exclusively on me. This is, I began, but my voice emerged as little more than a whisper. Comprehensive, he finished. 23 days of observation. Your patterns are quite fascinating, actually. I flipped through more pages. Detailed charts showed my daily schedule broken down to 15-minute increments. Monday through Sunday, color-coded by activity. Classes in blue, meals in red, library time in green. There were notations in the margins written in his careful handwriting. Subject always checks phone at 11:47 a.m. before entering Professor Chen's lecture and exhibits nervous gesture, touching left ear, when approaching social groups. How did you? My hands trembled slightly as I turned to a page titled Verbal Patterns and Recurring Phrases. Listed there, in meticulous detail, were things I said regularly, phrases I used when answering my phone, specific words I employed when frustrated, even the way I hummed under my breath while studying. But it was the last entry that made my skin feel suddenly too tight. When alone in room at night, subject mutters, "Not again," approximately every 47 minutes between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. I had no memory of saying that, no recollection of any nighttime muttering. You've been watching me sleep? His smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too white in the harsh fluorescent light. Observation is about dedication, about commitment to understanding the subject completely. The next section made my pulse quicken. Floor plans. Detailed architectural drawings of our dormitory room, complete with measurements and angles. Every piece of furniture was marked, every electrical outlet noted. But it was the yellow highlighting that made my mouth go dry. Areas marked as visual blind spots and camera-safe zones. Camera-safe? Every room has natural surveillance gaps, he explained, leaning forward. His breath smelled like winter mint and something else I couldn't identify. Places where someone could position themselves to observe without being detected, or where someone could position recording equipment. I stared at the yellow zones marked throughout our shared space. One behind my dresser, another in the corner near the window, a third, and my blood felt suddenly thick, positioned directly above my bed. You've been recording me. Have I? His head tilted slightly, like a bird examining something curious. Or have I simply been documenting the possibility, the theoretical vulnerability? The folder contained more. Pages of personal information I'd never shared with him. My hometown address, my parents' names and occupations, my high school girlfriend's phone number, details about my childhood that I'd never mentioned to anyone at the institute. Where did you get all this? Research is about thoroughness, about understanding not just what someone does, but why they do it. Who they were before they became who they are now. I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the heating system's inconsistent performance. Every movement seemed suddenly deliberate, every gesture potentially observed and catalogued. I found myself touching my left ear, that nervous gesture he'd documented, and immediately stopped. This is invasion of privacy. This is illegal. Is it? He pulled out a small digital recorder and set it on the desk between us. Everything I've documented is observable from public spaces or through information freely available online. I haven't entered your personal space without permission. I haven't violated any laws. The recorder's red light blinked steadily, like a tiny electronic heartbeat. You're recording this conversation too. I'm documenting it. for our study. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the linoleum floor with a sound like fingernails on concrete. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls closer together. Outside, the November wind had intensified, and somewhere in the building's infrastructure, a rhythmic tapping had begun. Metal expanding and contracting, or pipes settling, or something else entirely. This isn't a study. This is stalking. Stalking implies malicious intent. I'm simply observing patterns of behavior for academic purposes. He reached for the folder, but I pulled it back. The question is whether you're interested in conducting your own observational study, or if you prefer to remain the subject rather than the researcher. Something about the way he said subject made my skin crawl, like I was a specimen under examination. I want you to stop. Stop what, exactly? Stop being observant. Stop being thorough in my academic pursuits? His voice remained perfectly level, but something shifted in his eyes. Or stop noticing things you haven't yet noticed yourself. Before I could respond, he stood and moved toward the window. The darkness outside reflected our room back at us. Two figures in harsh fluorescent light, surrounded by the accumulated detritus of student life. But in the reflection, something seemed off. The proportions were wrong, or the angles, or maybe it was just the way the wind distorted the glass. Tell me, he said without turning around, have you been sleeping well lately? The question caught me off guard. The truth was, I hadn't. For weeks, I'd been waking throughout the night with a persistent sense that something was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly off, like a painting hung at an imperceptible angle that nonetheless made an entire room feel uncomfortable. I sleep fine. He turned back toward me, and for a moment his face was perfectly framed by the window's reflection, creating a disturbing double image. Because according to my observations, you've been experiencing significant sleep disturbances, frequent wake-ups, periods of restlessness. How could you possibly know that? Because I'm a good observer, because I pay attention to details others miss. He moved closer, and I noticed that his footsteps made no sound on the linoleum. For instance, I've noticed that you always check the locks on our door before going to bed. Twice. Sometimes 3 times. I did do that. When had that started? I've noticed that you've begun keeping your desk lamp on throughout the night, even though you never used to need ambient light for sleeping. That was also true. The complete darkness had started bothering me recently, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly when. And I've noticed that you always wake up at exactly 4:06 a.m. Every single night. You lie still for approximately 30 seconds, listening, then settle back to sleep. My throat felt dry. I don't remember waking up. Memory is unreliable, especially regarding sleep disruptions, but patterns don't lie. He sat back down, regarding me with that same analytical expression he wore during our criminal psychology seminars. The question is what you're waking up to hear. The room felt impossibly quiet. Even the heating system's groaning had stopped. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving only the faint electrical hum of the fluorescent bulb above us. I'm not hearing anything. No? Nothing at all? His smile returned, but it seemed different now, less friendly, more knowing. Not even that sound in the corridor? My pulse quickened. What sound? The one that happens every night at 4:06 a.m. A soft scraping noise like something being slowly dragged across the floor. It starts near the stairwell and moves down the hallway, stopping at different doors. Sometimes it stops at ours. I felt my hands clench involuntarily, because somewhere in the back of my mind I could almost remember that sound. Almost. Like trying to recall a dream after waking. You've been standing outside our door? Have I? Or have you simply been hearing someone, or something, that's already there? The fluorescent bulb flickered, casting momentary shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. In that brief dimness, his face appeared different. Older somehow, more angular. Every night for the past 3 weeks, he continued, that sound occurs at precisely 4:06 a.m. It moves methodically down the corridor, pausing at each room. But here's what's interesting. It only happens when you're scheduled to wake up. Scheduled. According to your pattern, you wake up every night at 4:06, listen for exactly 30 seconds, then return to sleep, almost like you're expecting to hear something specific. The room felt smaller again. The walls seemed to press inward, and the air had taken on a strange thickness that made breathing difficult. I want to see your documentation of this sound. What makes you think I've documented it? You document everything. His laugh was soft, almost gentle. True. But some things resist documentation. Some things only exist when they're not being directly observed. He reached into his jacket and produced another folder, smaller than the first, but somehow more unsettling. However, I have documented your responses to it. This folder contained photographs taken in near complete darkness, infrared images showing our room at night. In each photo, I was lying in bed, clearly awake, head turned toward the door. The timestamps all read 4:06 a.m. How many cameras do you have in here? That's the wrong question. What's the right question? The right question is whether the cameras are recording what's actually happening, or whether they're showing us what we expect to see. I stared at the infrared images. In some of them, there appeared to be shadows in the corridor visible through the gap beneath our door. Shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. There's something else, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Something I haven't included in either folder. He reached into his pocket and produced a small digital audio recorder, different from the one still blinking on the desk. This is from last night, recorded from 4:05 to 4:08 a.m. He pressed play. For several seconds, there was only the ambient sound of our room at night, distant heating, muffled sounds from other parts of the building, the faint electrical hum I'd grown accustomed to. Then, at exactly 4:06, something else emerged from the background noise. A soft scraping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, something being dragged slowly across a hard surface. It moved closer, the sound growing more distinct, until it seemed to stop directly outside our door. For 30 seconds, silence. Then footsteps moving away, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. You recorded this last night? I record every night. Why? Because, he said, rewinding the recording to play again, I wanted to understand what you're hearing, what you're responding to, what's making you wake up at exactly the same time every single night. The scraping sound filled our room again, seeming louder on the second playback, more defined, more deliberate. But here's what troubles me, he continued, stopping the recording. I've been awake every night at 4:06 a.m. for the past 3 weeks, listening for this sound, watching for any disturbance in the corridor. He leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the fluorescent light in a way that made them appear almost luminous. I've never heard it, not once, not even last night when this recording was made. The room fell silent again. Even the electrical hum seemed to have stopped. Outside, the campus had grown completely quiet, as if the entire world had paused to listen. That's impossible. Is it? Or is it simply improbable? He ejected the audio device and held it out toward me. The recording equipment captured something. The camera showed you responding to something. But I, sitting 3 feet away from you, experienced nothing at all. I took the recorder, noting how cold the metal felt against my palm. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply presenting data and allowing you to draw your own conclusions. He stood and moved toward his side of the room, gathering his materials. But I am curious about one thing. What? Tonight, when you wake up at 4:06 a.m., and you will wake up, because the pattern is remarkably consistent, I want you to do something different. He paused at his desk, organizing the folders with the same methodical precision he used for everything. Instead of lying still and listening for 30 seconds, I want you to get up, open the door, look into the corridor and tell me what you see. Why? Because, he said, settling into his desk chair and opening a textbook as if our conversation had been nothing more than casual academic discussion, I have a theory about what's happening to you, about what's been happening for much longer than 3 weeks. What kind of theory? He looked up from his book, and in the harsh fluorescent light, his features seemed sharper, more predatory. I think something has been watching you far longer than I have. Something that's very interested in your routines, your patterns, your vulnerabilities. Something that's been studying you with the same thoroughness I've documented. My chest felt tight. That's ridiculous. Is it? You've been unconsciously modifying your behavior for weeks, checking locks multiple times, keeping lights on, waking up at the same time every night. These aren't random changes. They're adaptive responses to a perceived threat. He turned back to his textbook, but continued speaking in that same measured tone. The question is whether the threat is real, or whether your mind is creating patterns to explain sensations you can't rationally understand. I stared at the recorder in my hand, then at the folders containing detailed documentation of my life. Everything felt surreal, like the boundaries between observation and invasion, between study and stalking, had become impossibly blurred. "Tonight," he said without looking up, "when you hear that sound, and you will hear it, remember that the most dangerous predators are the ones that make their prey feel like they're going crazy." The fluorescent bulb flickered again, and in that momentary darkness, I could have sworn I saw something move in the corridor outside our door. Just a shadow, just a shift in the ambient light, but my heart rate quickened nonetheless. When the light stabilized, he was watching me again, that knowing smile playing at his lips. "Sleep well," he said. "And remember, 4:06 a.m. Every night, like clockwork." Hours later, lying in bed with my desk lamp casting long shadows across the room, I found myself staring at the ceiling and waiting. My phone's digital display read 4:05 a.m., and despite every rational part of my mind insisting this was elaborate psychological manipulation, I could feel my heart rate increasing. 4:06 a.m. arrived like an appointment I'd forgotten I'd made. I woke, though I had no memory of falling asleep, to the sound of something moving in the corridor outside our door. Soft scraping, rhythmic and deliberate, exactly as recorded. But this time, instead of lying still and listening, I found myself sitting up in bed. Across the room, my roommate was apparently asleep, his breathing steady and undisturbed. The sound continued, moving closer to our door, then stopping directly outside. For 30 seconds, perfect silence. Then, against every instinct screaming at me to remain motionless, I stood up and moved toward the door. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I froze, certain I'd wake my roommate. But his breathing pattern never changed. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling slightly. Through the gap beneath the door, I could see a shadow that seemed too dense, too deliberate to be natural. I turned the handle slowly, the mechanism clicking softly in the darkness. The corridor was empty, but on the floor directly in front of our door was a manila folder, identical to the ones my roommate had shown me earlier. This one, however, had my name written across the tab in handwriting I didn't recognize. I picked it up and stepped back into our room, closing the door behind me. My roommate remained motionless in his bed, but something about his stillness seemed too perfect, too controlled. Inside the folder were photographs of me sleeping, dozens of them, taken from angles that should have been impossible given the layout of our room. In each image, I was alone in my bed, but the shadows on the walls formed shapes that suggested the presence of someone, or something, just outside the camera's range. At the bottom of the stack was a single sheet of paper with a message written in that same unfamiliar handwriting. "Thank you for participating in our study. Your behavioral patterns have been fascinating to observe. We look forward to continuing our research." It was signed with a name I'd never seen before, but as I read it, I realized something that made my blood feel like ice water in my veins. The signature was in my own handwriting. I looked across the room at my roommate, still apparently sleeping peacefully. But in the dim light from my desk lamp, I could see that his eyes were open, watching me with that same analytical expression he'd worn during our conversation. "Did you also hear the sound of the cutting in the corridor at 4:06? He asked quietly, his voice carrying easily across the room despite its softness. I looked down at the folder in my hands, then back at him. "What cutting?" His smile was barely visible in the darkness, but I could hear it in his voice. "Tomorrow night," he said, "we'll find out." Story 14. The fog had rolled in thick that Tuesday night, transforming Golden Gate Park into something primordial and strange. I should have turned back when the streetlights became distant halos bleeding through the mist, but insomnia had driven me from my apartment again, and the bike rides were the only thing that quieted the restless churning in my mind. 3 weeks since the promotion at the architectural firm, 3 weeks since the sleepless nights began. My doctor had suggested exercise, fresh air, routine. What he hadn't mentioned was how the darkness could swallow a person whole, how the familiar could become alien when filtered through exhaustion and pharmaceutical fog. The path around Stowe Lake stretched before me like a question mark, barely visible through the shifting gray. My bike's LED headlight carved a narrow cone through the murk, illuminating patches of eucalyptus bark and glimpses of water that seemed to move independent of any wind. The silence was complete, except for the soft whir of my wheels and the occasional distant hum of late-night traffic on the great highway. That's when I first heard the bells. Soft at first, almost melodic, like wind chimes caught in a gentle breeze. But there was no wind. The fog hung motionless, dense as cotton, and the sound seemed to drift from the direction of the lake itself. I slowed my pace, coasting now, listening. The bells weren't random. There was a pattern, a deliberate rhythm that spoke of human intention. 3 quick chimes, pause. 2 long ones, pause. Then a cascade of rapid notes that faded into the mist. It repeated, exact and precise, like a coded message transmitted across impossible distances. My rational mind cataloged explanations. Late-night joggers with reflective gear that jingled, maintenance workers, some kind of automated park system. But my gut, that primitive alarm system that evolution had gifted our species, was already screaming warnings. I dismounted and walked my bike closer to the water's edge, following the barely visible path that hugged the lake's perimeter. The fog seemed to thicken with each step, until I could barely see 5 feet in any direction. My world contracted to the small circle of illumination from my headlight and the steady pattern of those impossibly clear bells. That's when I saw the first silhouette, a figure on a bicycle, motionless about 20 yards ahead, positioned between the path and the water. Even through the fog, I could make out the distinctive outline of a long cape or cloak that hung from the rider's shoulders, black against the slightly lighter gray of the mist. The figure faced the lake, perfectly still, as if waiting. I stopped, thumb finding the button on my headlight to dim it. The last thing I wanted was to announce my presence to whatever midnight gathering this was. But as I watched, more shapes emerged from the fog, not approaching, simply materializing, as if they had been there all along and the mist had finally deigned to reveal them. 7 figures in total, all on bicycles, all wearing those same flowing black capes. They had arranged themselves in a precise semicircle along the lake's edge, their bikes pointed toward the water like compass needles drawn to some magnetic force beneath the surface. The bell pattern changed. What had been a gentle, almost random chiming became something more complex, more urgent. Each figure seemed to have their own bell, and they were playing in concert now, creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible with such simple instruments. The sound carried across the water and returned, echoing back with a clarity that defied the fog's muffling effect. But it wasn't just echoing. As I listened, straining to understand what I was witnessing, I realized the sounds coming back weren't quite the same. They were responses, counter-melodies that suggested another group somewhere across the lake, hidden in the mist, answering the calls of the caped riders. My throat went dry. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations, acoustics, echo effects, maybe another group of whatever these people were on the far shore, but there was something about the precision of it, the way the responding bells seemed to know exactly when to chime, that made the hair on my arm stand up beneath my jacket. I crept closer, wheeling my bike as quietly as possible. The fog provided cover, but it also distorted distances. What looked like 20 yards might have been 50 or 10. The figures remained motionless, their attention focused entirely on the water and their strange musical communication with whatever lurked in the mist across the lake. From this closer vantage point, I could see that the capes weren't quite right. They hung too perfectly, without any suggestion of a body beneath. No shifting weight, no slight movements that would indicate breathing. Even the most disciplined person would show some sign of life, some micro-adjustment or unconscious fidget. These figures were absolutely still, like statues draped in black cloth. The bell pattern shifted again, becoming more frantic, more insistent. The responses from across the lake came faster now, overlapping with the original calls until the air filled with a chaotic symphony of metallic voices. And underneath it all, I began to hear something else, a low humming that seemed to rise from the water itself, as if the lake were singing along. That's when the figure on the far left, without turning its head or shifting its position in any way, raised one arm and pointed directly at me. My blood turned to ice water. I hadn't made a sound, hadn't done anything to reveal my position, yet somehow, impossibly, it knew exactly where I was standing. The pointing arm was perfectly steady, aimed at my chest like an accusation. The bells stopped instantly, all of them, including the responses from across the lake. The sudden silence was deafening, pressing against my eardrums like a physical weight. Even the humming from the water ceased, leaving only the soft patter of condensed fog dripping from the eucalyptus branches above. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to drop the bike and sprint back toward the safety of the streetlights and late-night traffic. But I found myself frozen, hypnotized by that pointing finger and the terrible stillness of the scene. My bike's headlight began to flicker. At first I thought it was the battery dying, a mundane technical failure that would be almost welcome in the circumstances. But the pattern was too regular, too deliberate. 3 quick flashes, pause, 2 long ones, pause, then a rapid cascade of strobing light that matched exactly the bell pattern I had just heard. I hadn't touched the controls. My hands were gripping the handlebars so tightly that my knuckles had gone white, but I wasn't anywhere near the light switch. Yet my bike was somehow reproducing the mysterious code, signaling back to the silent figures arranged along the shore. The response came immediately, not from the bells this time, but from the water itself. The lake began to glow with a soft, phosphorescent light that pulsed in rhythm with my flickering headlight. Patches of luminescence drifted beneath the surface like underwater stars, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. I forced myself to blink, to look away, to break whatever spell was holding me in place. When I looked back, the figures were still there, still pointing, but something was wrong with the physics of the scene. The fog hadn't moved, yet I could see them more clearly now, as if some external light source had been turned on. That's when I realized I could see through them. Not completely, they weren't transparent like movie ghosts, but there was a quality to their silhouettes that suggested they weren't entirely solid, as if they were projections or shadows cast by something I couldn't see. The black capes rippled in a wind that didn't touch anything else, including the fog that surrounded them. My headlights strobed faster now, completely out of my control. The corresponding glow from beneath the water's surface intensified, and I could swear I saw shapes moving down there, long, sinuous forms that swam in circles, matching the arrangement of the figures on the shore. The pointing finger remained steady, unwavering in its accusation. I followed its line of sight and realized it wasn't pointing at me anymore. It was pointing through me, at something behind me. I turned around. The path I had followed to reach this spot was gone. Not obscured by fog, gone. Where there should have been solid ground and the familiar walkway that circled the lake, there was only water. Dark, still water that reflected no light and seemed to extend indefinitely into the mist. Panic rose in my throat like bile. I spun back toward the figures, desperate for some anchor point of reality, but they were changing. The capes were deflating, collapsing inward as if whatever had given them shape was dissolving, yet they remained upright. Impossible sculptures of empty fabric that pointed and watched with invisible eyes. My bike's rear light began flashing too, casting red strobes that mixed with the white of my headlight to create a nauseating pink haze. The water around me, because it was around me now, I was somehow standing on its surface, pulsed with increasing urgency. I looked down at my feet and saw that I was indeed standing on the lake's surface, my bike somehow balanced on water that felt solid as concrete. The phosphorescent shapes swam in lazy circles beneath me, and I could make out details now that made my stomach lurch. They were bicycles, dozens of them, ridden by figures in black capes that billowed through the water as if it were air. The underwater riders were looking up at me through the liquid medium, their bells still somehow audible despite being submerged. The sound reached me muffled and distorted, like music played through cotton, but the pattern was unmistakable. The same coded sequence that had drawn me to this impossible place. Above the surface, the empty capes were folding now, collapsing completely until they lay flat against the handlebars of abandoned bicycles. 7 bikes, perfectly arranged, with no sign that anyone had ever been riding them. My lights began to strobe in perfect synchronization, white and red pulses that seemed to trigger responses from the depths. Each flash revealed more details of the underwater procession, endless ranks of caped figures pedaling through the liquid darkness, their bells creating a symphony that existed in some space between sound and silence. I understood then that I was being invited to join them. The pointing finger had been an invitation, not an accusation. The coded bell patterns were instructions, a language that my bike's lights were somehow fluent in despite my ignorance. The surface beneath my feet began to soften, to ripple with the promise of descent. The underwater riders slowed their endless circling and turned to face me, their invisible faces tilted upward in expectation. My rational mind, that stubborn survivor of 3 weeks without proper sleep, offered one last desperate explanation. Hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the medications I'd been taking for insomnia. The fog, the isolation, the stress of the promotion, all of it combining to create this elaborate delusion. But if it was a hallucination, why could I feel the water beginning to accept my weight? Why could I taste copper in the air, hear harmonics in the bells that no human instrument could produce? The lights on my bike pulsed faster, more urgently, as if time were running out for whatever choice I was supposed to make. The empty capes on the shore rustled without wind, and the underwater procession began to move again, cycling past me in stately parade. I closed my eyes and made my decision. When I opened them, I was standing on the familiar path around Stowe Lake, fog swirling around me but no longer impenetrable. My bike's lights were functioning normally, casting steady beams that revealed nothing more mysterious than eucalyptus bark and patches of water. No figures, no bells, no glowing water or underwater riders. Just me, my bike, and the ordinary darkness of a San Francisco park at 2 a.m. I rode home quickly, eager to put distance between myself and whatever had or hadn't happened by the lake. But even now, 3 days later, I can't shake the feeling that I failed some kind of test. That I was offered something, membership, understanding, transformation, and I turned away. The insomnia persists. The medications don't help. And sometimes when I'm lying awake at 3 a.m, I can hear faint bells drifting through my apartment window, playing patterns that my bike lights once knew how to answer. Tomorrow night I think I'll go back to the park. And this time, when the figures point at me through the fog, I won't close my eyes. I think I'm ready to learn what lies beneath the surface of Stowe Lake. Even if it means discovering that the only thing down there is the reflection of my own fractured mind, cycling endlessly through waters that exist only in the space between sleeping and waking. The bells are calling again, and this time, I'm going to answer. Story 15. The thermal paper voucher felt wrong in my pocket from the moment she handed it to us. I should have trusted that first instinct, that subtle wrongness that crawled up my spine like a warning. But vacation mode had settled over me like a warm blanket, dulling the sharp edges of suspicion that usually kept me alert. The resort in Cozumel had been everything the brochures promised. Crystalline waters, endless buffets, and that particular brand of manufactured paradise that money could buy. My girlfriend had been radiant in the Mexican sun, her laughter echoing across the pool deck as she sipped her third margarita of the afternoon. The woman who approached us wore the resort's standard white polo and khaki shorts, but something about her uniform seemed slightly off. The fabric looked newer, crisper, as if it had never seen a washing machine. Her name badge bore the resort's logo but lacked the usual employee photo, displaying only the word concierge in bold letters. She moved with purposeful efficiency as she explained the spa upgrade, a complimentary couples massage that had become available due to a last-minute cancellation. The offer seemed too good to refuse. The resort's spa treatments typically cost more than our flight, and here was this woman insisting we could have the premium package at no charge. My girlfriend's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that made saying no impossible. The concierge mentioned they would need to move quickly to secure the appointment, as another couple was also being considered for the upgrade. What struck me as odd was how she refused to let us return to our room to change or gather anything. Time was of the essence, she insisted, guiding us immediately toward the main building. The spa was located on the 3rd floor, she explained, but the elevators were temporarily out of service for maintenance. She would need to escort us through an alternate route. The service corridor smelled of industrial cleaning solutions and something else I couldn't identify, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting intermittent shadows that seemed to move independently of our bodies. The walls were painted an institutional green that reminded me uncomfortably of hospital corridors. Our guide walked ahead with confident strides, her footsteps echoing in the narrow space. She spoke continuously as we walked, filling the air with details about the treatments we would receive, the expert therapists who would be attending to us, the imported oils and healing stones that would melt away our vacation stress. Her voice had a rehearsed quality, as if she had delivered this exact monologue dozens of times before. The corridor seemed longer than it should have been. I tried to maintain my bearings, mentally mapping our route from the lobby, but the turns we made didn't align with my understanding of the building's layout. We passed numerous doors marked with cryptic codes and symbols, some slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms filled with equipment I couldn't identify. The air grew cooler as we walked deeper into the building's interior. When we finally stopped, it was before a door marked simply SPA, in adhesive letters that appeared to have been applied hastily. The sign was crooked, secured with strips of double-sided tape that caught the flickering light. Above us, a security camera pointed toward the ceiling, its lens directed away from the hallway as if someone had deliberately adjusted its angle. The concierge turned to face us with a smile that seemed too wide, too practiced. She explained that the therapist needed 5 minutes to prepare the treatment room, ensuring the oils were properly heated and the ambiance was perfect for our experience. I would need to wait outside while they prepared, she said, as men weren't permitted in the preparation area due to spa policies. My girlfriend squeezed my hand before following the woman through the door. Her touch lingered longer than usual, and when I looked into her eyes, I saw a flicker of something I couldn't name. Uncertainty? Fear? The door closed behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo in the empty corridor. Left alone, I reached into my pocket for the voucher, thinking I might review the details of our treatment. The thermal paper felt warm beneath my fingers, and as I unfolded it, I watched in fascination as the printed text began to fade before my eyes. The letters dissolved like they were being erased by an invisible hand, leaving behind only blank white paper that grew warmer with each passing second. The silence in the corridor felt oppressive, broken only by the mechanical hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of what might have been music or voices. I couldn't tell which. I strained to listen for sounds from within the spa room, hoping to hear my girlfriend's voice or the conversation I expected between her and the therapists. Instead, there was only an unnatural quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The voucher in my pocket had become completely blank, the paper now uncomfortably hot against my leg. I approached the door and pressed my ear against its surface, listening for any indication of activity within. The wood felt unusually cold, as if the room beyond had no heating. When I knocked softly and called out, My voice seemed to be absorbed by the door itself, producing no echo, no response. A creeping unease began to settle in my chest. I examined the makeshift spa sign more closely, noting how the adhesive letters were beginning to peel at the edges. The double-sided tape held the sign crookedly, and I could see where previous attempts had been made to position it correctly. Small tears in the tape and residue on the door indicated this was not the first time someone had hastily applied this particular sign. The camera above continued to point uselessly at the ceiling, and I found myself wondering when it had been repositioned and by whom. Resort security cameras were typically monitored and maintained carefully, yet this one seemed to have been forgotten or deliberately tampered with. The more I studied my surroundings, the more details emerged that suggested this area was not quite what it appeared to be. I decided to explore the corridor, thinking I might find another entrance to the spa, or at least locate someone who could explain the delay. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with doors that bore no identifying marks beyond numbered codes. As I walked, my footsteps seemed to echo differently than they had when we first arrived, as if the acoustic properties of the space had somehow changed. At the far end of the corridor, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Two identical doors stood side by side, both marked with the same crooked SPA sign, both secured with the same hastily applied double-sided tape. The symmetry was perfect, unsettling, as if someone had created a mirror image of the room where I had left my girlfriend. I stood frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. Had I somehow gotten turned around in the corridor? Was this the same door I had started from, viewed from a different angle? The layout of the building began to feel impossible, defying the basic laws of geometry and architecture. As I stood there, both doors opened simultaneously. From each doorway, a pair of hands emerged, identical hands wearing pristine white latex gloves. The hands beckoned to me with synchronized movements, curling and uncurling their fingers in perfect unison. No faces appeared in the doorways, no voices called out. Only those hands, moving with mechanical precision, inviting me to approach. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ventilation system seemed to have stopped, leaving me in a vacuum of sound that made my own heartbeat thunderous in my ears. The hands continued their rhythmic beckoning, patient and persistent, as if they could wait indefinitely for my decision. I took a step backward, then another, my eyes fixed on those impossibly identical gestures. The hands showed no signs of fatigue, no variation in their movement. They belonged to no one I could see, extending from darkness that seemed to swallow light rather than simply lacking it. The voucher in my pocket had begun to burn against my skin, the thermal paper now radiating heat that penetrated through the fabric of my clothes. I pulled it out with trembling fingers, watching as it crumbled to ash in my hand, the pieces floating away as if carried by a wind that existed only in that narrow space. Behind me, I heard the soft click of another door opening. When I turned, I saw a third SBA entrance, this one bearing a sign that looked freshly applied, the adhesive letters perfectly aligned and the tape invisible. More hands emerged from this doorway, wearing the same latex gloves, making the same beckoning gesture with the same mechanical precision. My breathing became shallow, rapid. The corridor seemed to be stretching, adding new doors and new hands with each moment that passed. The fluorescent lights above flickered more rapidly now, creating a stroboscopic effect that made the beckoning hands appear to multiply and divide, creating an army of identical gestures that filled my peripheral vision. I ran. My feet pounded against the industrial carpeting as I fled back the way I had come, or at least the direction I thought led to safety. The corridor twisted and turned in ways I didn't remember, presenting new passages and doorways that seemed to have materialized from nothing. Behind me, I could hear the soft whisper of multiple doors opening, the almost inaudible rustle of latex gloves moving through air. When I finally burst through a door marked exit, I found myself standing in the resort lobby, gasping and disoriented. Guests moved past me with casual indifference, their vacation conversations and laughter creating a surreal contrast to the silence I had just escaped. The normal sounds of civilization, ice machines, distant music, the clink of glasses, felt like a symphony after the oppressive quiet of the service corridor. I approached the front desk with urgent questions about the spa, about the concierge who had offered us the upgrade, about my girlfriend who had disappeared into that impossibly configured space. The clerk, a young man with the resort's standard friendly demeanor, listened to my frantic explanation with growing confusion. There was no spa on the third floor, he informed me. The resort's spa was located in a separate building entirely, accessible only through the garden pathway. No upgrades had been offered that day, and no one matching the description of our concierge was employed by the resort. The service corridors were restricted areas, off-limits to guests, and certainly not used for accessing amenities. When I described the woman who had approached us, providing details about her uniform and badge, the clerk's expression shifted from confusion to concern. He suggested I speak with security, that perhaps I had become disoriented in the heat or affected by the altitude. Had I been drinking? Was I feeling well? The questions stung because they echoed the doubts that were already forming in my mind. Had I imagined the entire experience? Was stress manifesting in ways I hadn't anticipated? The thermal voucher was gone, crumbled to ash, leaving no evidence of the encounter. My girlfriend was nowhere to be found, and according to the resort staff, she had never existed in their system. No record of a couple's booking, no registration under her name. I spent the remainder of my vacation searching. I walked every corridor, examined every door, questioned every employee. The service area I remembered could not be located, despite my detailed recollections of the route we had taken. Security cameras throughout the resort showed me moving alone through the lobby, pausing occasionally, as if in conversation with empty air. The medical evaluation they eventually insisted upon revealed nothing abnormal. Blood work, neurological tests, psychological assessments, all came back within normal ranges. The resort physician suggested that vacation stress, combined with unfamiliar surroundings and perhaps too much sun, could create powerful hallucinatory experiences. Dehydration, he noted, was more common than tourists realized and could produce remarkably vivid false memories. But late at night, when the resort settled into its artificial quiet, I could still hear the soft whisper of latex gloves moving through air. In my peripheral vision, hands continued to beckon from doorways that shouldn't exist, gesturing with mechanical patience that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. The voucher might have crumbled to ash, the corridor might have vanished, and my girlfriend might never have existed at all. But the beckoning never stopped, and somewhere in the space between sleep and waking, I can still see those perfectly identical doors opening in perfect synchronization, revealing identical hands that know exactly how long they can wait. I returned home alone, carrying questions that have no answers and memories that might never have been real. The only thing I know with certainty is that when I close my eyes, I can still feel the thermal paper burning against my skin, and I can still hear the soft click of doors that open onto rooms that cannot exist. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I wonder if I'm still standing in that corridor, still watching those hands beckon from doorways that lead to nowhere. And sometimes I wonder if the man who returned from vacation is really me at all, or simply another upgrade that someone decided to offer.